and welcome to the next edition of the Hack the Planet podcast. And today we have a very special episode. We are going to be taking the bolt gun to a particular sacred cow. Something that has affected all of our lives, that we all have very passionate feelings about, mostly irritation. The topic for today's episode is threat modeling. And now this is a interesting topic. It's a topic that's been drastically overcomplicated. And there is a particular book out there written by someone that he's a local here. We know him. I've worked with him in the past. His name is Adam Shostack. I'm sorry, Adam. We're going to have to be a little bit rough with your book today. We're going to be talking about what threat modeling is, what threat modeling isn't, and where all of this confusion comes from. So we have trainers, going around telling people, we have consultants going around telling people, oh, you have to do threat modeling, right? We have, risk places, insurance companies, oh, you have to do threat modeling. It's part of a secure, development life cycle. Okay. And then people think, well, what is threat modeling? And there was a bunch of stuff on, risk registers and that from like the 90s. We're gonna talk about in a little bit more detail, and going back to like the 70s and even before that, going back before computers. There was the concept of managing risk is older than computers, and there was a way of doing it that is still the best way of doing it. That is the way people have been doing it forever, and is the way I think everybody does it naturally. Like the example I use, it's like, what is threat modeling? What are we talking about? It is so you do this all the time in your daily life, right? And my favorite example is you see a speed limit sign, right? No one else is on the road, or the HOV lane is a better example. Okay, so you gotta back when you had to drive to work, there's an HOV lane. There's some fine if you go in the HOV lane and there's only one person in your car. But frequently the HOV lane is not crowded and the rest of the highway is crowded. Okay? So you do a little math in your head. You say, okay, it's a $200 fine to go in the HOV lane if I get pulled over, but I've never seen anyone get pulled over in there. Maybe once or twice in the last 10 years. Okay? So you got to figure, if this is something you're doing every day, maybe it's worthwhile to drive in the HOV lane every day and just risk a ticket. And then if you eventually do get a ticket, you can just sort of be self-insured, right? You can just put a little money aside every day, and then someday you will have to pay this ticket, and you're figuring, oh, maybe it comes out to like 20 cents a day on average to skip the traffic, and that's worth it to me, right? So there's like a kind of complicated operation that happened here. There's a bit of probability. How likely is this to happen? And there's a bit of, and the other part of that is how much does it cost me if it does happen, right? And from that, you get the expected value of what the daily risk is for driving in the HOV lane. And if you were really, really worried about it, you could get a creepy real doll and just be like, put a hat on it and just be weird. I had all the company, like Sears is going out of business. I have a Sears mannequin I got. That I was serious? Oh, absolutely. It's sitting in the garage right now. I got it for like $15 when they were selling all the stuff off of Sears. And I kind of was going to put a hat on it and put it in the shotgun seat or whatever. But I kind of like it in the garage because people turn a corner and they see it and they start screaming, right? Because it's the absolute creepiest thing to find in a dark corner. But that's a tangent. Anyway, so
hold on.
Yeah.
You know what the actual, in my opinion, I think probably one of the best analogies with regards to risk management for the average person that they've probably all heard but don't necessarily recognize immediately. It's the formula in Fight Club. That's the thing. That is like probably the best example that everyone's at least heard once.
Don't talk about Fight Club.
No.
Also, don't talk about Fight Club.
Also, don't talk about Fight Club. That's the one. You got me. There's a scene where he's flying on a plane and he's trying to explain to someone what he does as like a risk assessor for an insurance company, right? And so he walks them through the entire process of like, how does a company decide whether or not to perform a recall in an event that they recognize that there's a probability of failure of their product that results in the death of a person? That algorithm is exactly what risk management is. There is no such thing as perfect security. There's no such thing as perfectly addressing a risk such that it will never occur. Like, not really. At least anyone with enough experience realizes that that's not possible. It's mostly about just gaming the probability so that the likelihood of it is extremely low. And even if it did happen, the resulting impact or blast radius is not going to tank the company.
How does he describe it in the movie? He's a guy that investigates recalls, right? Like for
Yeah, he
airlines,
says take
he looks at
take the number of the vehicles in the field, A, multiply that by the probability of the rate of failure, B, multiply by the average out of court settlement, C, A times B times C equals X. If X is less than the cost of a total recall, we don't do one.
That is a threat model.
That is a threat model.
And you know what is not a threat model? A data flow diagram. A data flow diagram is not a threat model. Okay, we'll come back to that. Anyway, I forgot to do introduction, so let's go around real quick. So joining me on the call today, we have Daniel. Say hello, Daniel.
How's it going, guys?
Hey. We also have Dan, not to be confused with Daniel. Say
again.
hello, Dan.
Hello.
And we got Justin.
It's good to see all your beautiful faces again.
Now, I have actually done an enormous amount of threat modeling, mostly in the old style, which I know the two companies that I've done work for that have the most serious risk management problems are Intel and Lego. And I know that both of those routinely use kind of the more actuarial risk register style and not the the data flow diagram style.
Yep.
And I've also my main day job for the last I don't know how many years has been talking to dev teams and helping them work through their threat model, because a lot of these companies, they have requirements that the execs come down from on high. They went to some training, they read some book or whatever, and they're like, oh, you have to do threat modeling. So they don't necessarily, they're like, oh, that sounds like a good idea, and they turn around and they tell everybody, oh, you have to do threat modeling, and then they end up Googling it. What is threat modeling? Right? Like, my boss just told me we have to do this now. And then they find this book by Adam Shostack, which is like threat modeling, my tragic story, or whatever the subtitle is. But now a little bit of backstory on that, and related to the so Adam Shostack has been working at Microsoft for forever, and he was working on he's been working at Microsoft since the bad old days of Microsoft, where they basically didn't care about any security bugs at all, because they could just intimidate people into not making them fix anything, right? And then around 2003, 2004, there was a big, they called I think it was the blaster worm, right? There was a bad wormable bug that went all over, and then they got a lot of grief because Word document hacking basically compromised every U.S. government department in the 2004 to 2009 time period, just on Word docs, like exploits in Word docs. And so Microsoft started to kind of wake up and be like, hey, we need to figure out some way of formally addressing the problem of security bugs in source code. And so they put some of their people out in the weeds to like do research and come up with novel techniques to do this. And Shostack was one of those, and he came up with a whole philosophy behind it, which does it has some problems inside of Microsoft. It has some benefits, but it's not. I don't think it quite lives up to the hype, the potential. It's so what his method boils down to, or I don't know if it's his method, but this is the Microsoft method, right? They basically require they require every dev team when they're doing a project in the design phase, they have to create a threat model for their project, and that threat model is a data flow diagram. It is circles and arrows, and the circles are abstract components in their system. Like they could be network services. They're usually network services in the data flow diagram, but there's no real rules about the level of granularity, right? So you could have one circle that is actually a bunch of things inside it, and you could have another circle that is just one thing inside it. And you don't really know, right? So there's these amorphous circles that are just abstract, like this network over here talks to this network over there, or it could be this service over here talks to that service over here. Okay.
Yeah.
So they have a data flow diagram. They have labeled services. They have connections that mean data. Data is flowing from here to there, usually network connection. And then they draw what they call trust boundaries on this data flow diagram. And
term.
Yeah. So now in like whether or not a trust boundary has any meaning, I'm going to circle back around to that in a sec. But so they draw these like for example, if you have the open internet where you don't trust anything on one side and you have your data center on the other, there's a trust boundary between the internet and your data center, and maybe that's protected by your load balancer, right? And that's kind of what that means. It's like if you have a more trusted zone over there and a less trusted zone over there, you draw a line between it. Okay, so you have these circles and arrows, and you have these lines that are trust boundaries. And from there, they algorithmically apply. Have you heard of Stride?
Yes.
Or
Microsoft
what's the other one?
Stride,
Yeah, Dread. Dread is the other one.
Dread. Yes, I love Dread.
Dread. So I don't remember what
mostly
Dread.
because I love the acronym.
Yeah. So these are acronyms that are supposed to help you remember what the categories are of different types of threats. However, they're pretty terrible because basically everything ends up as privilege escalation. But the Stride stands for spoofing, tampering. I don't remember.
Repudiation.
Oh, repudiation, which no one has ever used on anything, by the way. Like nobody cares about repudiation. And then what is I? Information disclosure.
Yep.
And then denial of service and escalation, right? So in practice, denial of service is always possible, no matter what. If they spend more money, they can DOS you. That's just true, right? Like and so no one really cares about denial of service unless you're inflicting it on yourself. You want to avoid doing that. And no one cares about like repudiation. Spoofing is like you don't do spoofing unless you're trying to escalate privilege. So nothing is spoofing by itself without being a privilege escalation. So everything ends up as a privilege escalation, right? So everything gets categorized as E in the Stride model. But this is all a tangent, right? So in the Microsoft threat modeling tool, they made they made 4 different versions of a software tool to help you edit these circles and arrows with trust boundary lines on them. And once you make your circles and arrows, your data flow diagram with the trust boundary, you hit a button that's like generate, and it goes through, and every time one of your data flows crosses a trust boundary, it generates a series of questions that are in the format, for this crossing, have you considered S? Have you considered T? Have you considered R? Have you considered I? Have you considered D? Or have you considered E? Which is like not helpful.
It's
right?
It's Mad Lib feature requirement to whoever's actually answering the question, which may not actually be the architect who actually understands how the system is supposed to work.
But also,
also has little to no understanding of any of the intermediary systems between node A and node B that they're connecting. So any of their answers are, like just finger in the wind.
In practice, they made every dev team fill one of these out for 10 years across several different versions of the tool. And at the end of it, you look at all the data, and since the names of things weren't normalized, there's no way to stitch anything together. People just wrote random strings and made circles at random. So there's no way to say, oh, this service that has this name in this threat model can be connected to this service that has this name in this threat model. There's no way of doing it. Like, we tried.
It's so great. It's so great coming from the actuarial mindset, right? going into an environment, being handed like, oh yeah, we do threat modeling. Here's our data. And they actually have it structured somewhere, like actually not in docs. And then you get to it, it's like, cool, I have an NLP problem. Thanks, guys. There's no structure to this at all. Like, this is not useful.
but also the quote unquote, I'm doing air quotes, threats identified by the threat modeling tool are not good. Right?
No,
have you considered repudiation? Is
yeah, I don't get the stride model. Like when I think of threats, that's not what I think of. Is like, are they going to spoof something?
No, well, I mean, you want to when you're trying to understand what's going on, you want a little bit more of information, right? Like what does
matters.
Context matters, exactly. What does that threat mean against this service? Like, does this data even care? Like, does anyone even need protection against repudiation on this? And so when you get into more mature methods of threat modeling, we could call it the actuarial model, right? Which is what SANS, the training company SANS, was pushing in the 90s. So if you we'll try and find some links to these, but if you Google for SANS trainings on threat modeling from the 90s, they actually recommend the same thing that Intel does, the same thing that Lego does, and the same thing that I do, which is you use a spreadsheet. And I usually pause and wait for laughter at this point.
Well, because I agree with that. Like, I totally agree with that. Like, there's a book that I love called How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk. And you don't even have to get the book. They have a helper site, How to Measure Everything in Cybersecurity Risk /cybersecurity. And then they have spreadsheets that they give you that cover all of those basic things that Daniel was talking about earlier. Like, what is the probability of loss over a year? What is the lower bound, the upper bound? What is the percentage this will happen? What is the risk tolerance? So yeah, like I'm all for that actual, crunch the numbers math kind of way to compute it.
Yep.
Probability.
Me too. I've developed a couple of my own kind of Excel tables that I kind of compiled from SANS and other examples. Like, basically, anytime you see a column you like in anyone else's table, you just steal that column, and then so I have the columns I like, but I've figured out which columns are most important and why. So the reason you use a table and not a data flow diagram, there's a couple of big reasons. There's a couple of deal breakers with data flow diagrams. The first one is if you're not doing like microservices in the network, a data flow diagram can't even address, you can't even describe a lot of common tech situations with a data flow diagram. The example that I run into most often is working on hardware. So I've done an enormous amount of threat modeling of hardware projects where there is a hardware components talking to a network backend and all kinds of crazy, extra considerations all over the place, right? So it's like when you're working at hardware, we've got risks from like glitching. We've got risks from like EM side channel attacks, so if you try and draw a data flow diagram, where does my EM probe go? Right? Like, are we drawing the power connection into the computer now on the data flow diagram because someone is like monitoring your power consumption inside the wall in order to like get your crypto keys out? Right? And but the problem, generically, I describe this as data flow diagrams do not capture environmental threats. They do not capture environmental threats at all, because fundamentally you draw circles, you draw arrows, the environment is the background. It's the rest of the paper. And in a hardware project, the rest of the paper is potentially threatening. And at that point, you can't, like, if you color everything to black, you're like, it's pointless, right? So you should just use a table where the rows of the table, you can have rows like, what is the threat I'm worried about? That's a column. Sorry, it's a column, right? You have a column that is like, describe the concern. I have a column that's what component is the concern pertaining to. Okay, you have, and then you get into the bit I was hinting at the beginning, right? So the actuarial stuff. What is the likelihood that this problem will occur, and what is the impact if this problem does occur? And those are two universal things in all risk modeling going back centuries. And I took a mountain climbing course last year. And I found out that the way they describe avalanche risk is likelihood and impact, right? And so when we typically, you figure out what the total threat is. Likelihood times impact is the total severity of the threat, right? And but it also works out if you just add them, as it turns out. So for avalanche danger, they don't multiply them; they just add it. Likelihood plus impact is the total severity, and that's the only wrinkle. That's the only thing that's different. And then I found out that the same likelihood times impact thing goes back. It's been used to capture risk going back forever, because it is, if anyone took a probability class at any point, that is the cornerstone of probability, right? What are the odds that something will happen times the value of it happening, right? And I think most people got a little bit of that. And like, I actually never took a probability class, but they told me that in high school in the regular math class, because I think they were trying to talk people out of buying lottery tickets or something. I have no idea. But this is it's also, I've also heard this basic thing called the gambler's algorithm, right? And it's the cornerstone of life. It's the cornerstone of not even just sentient life. Cats do this, right? Like even animals that just operate on base instinct, they do some calculation. Can I win this fight or should I run away? Right? So cats don't fight things the same size as them like dogs do. Cats don't have a great immune system, and they're just biased towards, if something is small and they think it's an easy win, they'll go right for it. And if it's not an easy win, they'll bail. Dogs have a bit more resilient of an immune system, and they will go all in on dumber bets. Pretty frequently. I have dogs. They've been trying to die by accident all week. So, but they're fine. They're just crazy. They're very hyper. Anyway, so and it's the same. It's like if you're deciding whether or not to speed on the highway, right? Like, what do I gain by doing it? What do I risk by doing it? And that does not lend itself at all well to a data flow diagram. And data flow diagrams are fine to help people brainstorm, right? And data flow diagrams are necessary if you're looking at a service and you're trying to come up with a threat model for it. Data flow diagrams should be a mandatory part of your design documentation. And all of your design documentation should be done or in progress before you go to a security reviewer, so that the security reviewer understands what it is you're asking them to evaluate.
So coming out of the ivory tower for a second, right? Like, yeah. I think that's exactly why in the wild we see the conflation between design diagrams and threat modeling. What's actually happening is for environments for security programs in enterprises that are underfunded, that don't have as much resources, and whose engineering programs themselves are not necessarily as mature, you'll end up seeing them trying to conflate the spoonful of sugar, right? Like it's like, get the engineering team to take their medicine. Hey, do these design things that you're supposed to be doing anyway, but I'm going to force it as a matter of security practices because I have the regulatory requirement that's backing me up. Right? This should be something that you produce yourself, but if you're not going to do it, well, I guess I tied it to policy.
And that's exactly what happened at Microsoft, and that's why they probably won't ever get rid of it either. Because requiring that all devs fill out a threat model actually just requires them to make a data flow diagram and actually make design docs, and otherwise they might not do that. So what I actually asked people, and I pointed out, like, why don't you just stop making everyone do this because you're not doing anything with the data anyway? They were like, but then we wouldn't get any data flow diagrams. And I was like, actually, that's a really solid point. I have nothing. Like, I'm sold. I'm really just complaining that you're calling that a threat model, and that's like, who cares? You can call anything you want.
So I go off in an argument in a different direction, because as much as I am a huge fan and proponent of the actuarial model for threat modeling, I also don't actually, like, I don't mind data flow diagrams. In fact, in most cases, when you have multiple parties that don't actually have any understanding of what the heck the system actually is end to end, the data flow diagram is a really great way to get them all on the same page really fast. Here's the problem.
I like ice cream and I like cookies, but that does not mean ice cream is cookies.
And that's you're not going to hear a counter argument from me. The point that I was going to make actually is that one of the biggest challenges that I view often is, again, that you touched on it. You touched on multiple symptoms of the same problem, right? And that is engineers who don't have experience going through the process of creating formal documents to outline their intent, right? Their goals, right? Their output goals. You'll end up in situations where the material is variable quality, right? Produced by humans, variable quality. And every time there's variance in the quality of the output translates to variance in the utility of the output itself, right? So from my perspective, data flow diagrams are great. They're even better when they're generated by a fucking machine. Like, I actually have no interest in making humans build data flow diagrams. We don't need that anymore. There's so much infrastructure in place now in modern developments, environments, that you can effectively model and produce any artifact you want. There are 3 principles that drive me for almost every single threat modeling program that I ever end up being a part of. One is every minute, every hour, an engineer is doing anything other than writing code is opportunity cost of the business. Period. Full stop. I don't care about. You can make any other arguments and they're all wrong. like capitalism says produce software because that's how we make money. Any single time somebody's doing anything other than producing software, not making money. Full stop. So if that's a driving principle and you want to align with that and you want to get the business 100% behind the way you want to change their internal processes, like easy, quick win. Figure out how to produce all of the other, figure out how to satisfy all of the processes in the business as programmatically as possible. Automate the shit out of everything. The more you can do that, better everybody wins.
So wait. That's actually super interesting, and I want to ask a follow-up question. So if you have all of your stuff in AWS, right, and you can like scrape all of your IAM permissions out and all of your virtual networks and all and all that stuff, like Scout Suite does from NCC Group, I want to say, which Scout Suite is dope, by the way. I highly recommend it. We'll have to put that in the links. But so if everything's in AWS and you can pull everything out of AWS, I can see how you could automatically generate a data flow diagram because because it's like software defined network basically, and all of the network connections are explicitly defined somewhere in these files. But what I'm wondering is that the only situation you can automatically generate a data flow diagram, or are there other situations where
there are other situations? So we got sidetracked before I finished the top principle. So anytime a developer is doing anything other than writing code is an opportunity cost to the business. The most accurate design diagram of a system is the code itself. Everything is code, meaning infrastructure is code. All of your orchestration logic, automation, and like post runtime instantiation scripts, everything is code. That's item 3. And then item 4, a diagram is expired the second it's made.
I did want to comment on the Scout Suite tool. I just recently played with some really cool tools like cartography. I forget who it's by, but it does like Bloodhound, where it'll map the relationship of all the objects in the environments in Neo4j for you. It's really sweet.
Is that Bloodhound for AWS?
Pretty much, yeah. And then it'll tie into other services like Okta and stuff too. It's crazy.
So we've been kind of waiting for that actually. So the last 2 jobs I've had, I had to write something like Bloodhound for AWS because there wasn't like there was that what was that one that starts with a P mapper or something like that? Yeah, P
mapper by NCC Group. Yeah, I got a lot of these ideas from your conversation in our chat.
Oh, great.
Actually, that's how I started exploring them.
Anyway, just to bring it back to threat modeling. So I think
before we go too deep into red teaming.
Yeah, we're just. Well, that's you can tell where our biases lie, but to bring it back to the main topic for the moment. I think it would be interesting. I'd like to talk about sort of my method of threat modeling a little bit and what I think is important, what I think is valuable. And I'd be really interested to hear what you guys do also. So I am a big fan of the actuarial model that uses a lot of Excel tables. The reason that I'm a fan of this is because I believe that the purpose of a threat model is to communicate risk up the hierarchy from the technical people that actually understand what the problem is to the less technical people that understand what the business is and also how much money they have. Because the technical people have no idea how much money they have. Like they have I don't know how much money the company has at all. No one will tell me, right? I'm an engineer. Like I definitely shouldn't know anything about money, right? I half the time they don't even want you to know who the customers actually are. Yeah. So, and they definitely don't want you to talk to them. Holy crap. But so, in order to communicate risk up, you need to remove detail and up-level the features of the information that are important for somebody to make an informed risk decision, even if they don't understand the technical details. That's the purpose of it. And the reason, the main reason that using a table is great is that you know, part of it is that you don't run into these dead ends, like from environmental threats or things that you're worried about that you want to have a mitigation for, but that you can't find a place for in a data flow diagram. Because maybe it's not even involved, like maybe it's not related to data moving, right? Maybe it's related to something totally else. So you can capture anything in a table that you can describe with words, right? Because there's just a description cell and you just write in what it is you're worried about. So,
Right. So,
but
yeah.
the main advantage to this though is that you have likelihood columns and you have impact columns where you can measure different aspects of likelihood and impact. Like, you know, for impact, you could have like something like, oh, is there a compliance issue with this? Oh, is there a legal issue with this? Is there a privacy issue with this? Is it a big reputation risk? Is it a big monetary loss to the company? Is it a lot of downtime, right? How much downtime? And you can have all these subfields that help you calculate what the total impact is. Okay. And for likelihood, you can have subfields that help you calculate what the total likelihood is. What is the attacker profile that is required to pull off this attack? Do you need a high-skilled attacker or a low-skilled attacker could do it? Is there already a tool in GitHub that does it? Is there working proof of concept? Does it require a capital investment? Do you need $300 worth of stuff? Do you need $1,000 worth of stuff? Right? Does it require a nation state to like break crypto and actually like go and kidnap someone's family or something? Right?
Yeah, that field always, to me, I
Well,
always find that field is
but the thing is like
labeled.
High, we call it a high resource attacker, right? So it's like a low resource attacker. There's a medium resource attacker. There's a high resource attacker, and you can define that however you want.
T-shirt sizing is way better than actual dollar amounts, but yeah.
Oh, it doesn't matter, right? You can have whatever columns you're comfortable with, whatever meets your context, and that's actually a really big advantage of using Excel or a spreadsheet, is that everybody knows how to use Excel. Yep. It's like you knew when you were born at this point. It's like it's been around forever. Even people of the previous generation could use it. You know, it's like something everybody understands. Whereas, you know, you get into the data flow diagram tools, it's a whole other ball of wax. But you have likelihood columns, you have impact columns. You add them together, you have total likelihood, you have total impact. You multiply those together, you make a new column, which is your total severity. Okay? And at the end of the day, you can sort an Excel table by the total severity column, and you can reverse sort it, and you end up with a prioritized list of security problems from most serious to least serious. And then what I like to do, because it's Excel, I like to color the rows red, yellow, or green based on if it ended up being a high severity, medium severity, low severity. So literally, somebody looks at this spreadsheet, they see the red lines, they see the yellow lines, they see the green lines, you know, and they get a sense of what security investments need to be made and why. And depending on what their level of understanding is, they can just read the parts of the table that they understand, right? Everybody understands red, yellow, green. Cool. The description, you know, should be general enough that non-technical people can understand it. But then I usually have columns for existing mitigations and planned mitigations or possible mitigations, right? So that and when you add a mitigation, once a mitigation goes in, you reduce the likelihood and impact to be after the mitigation is applied, right? And then the total severity will drop. And when you do the sort, that issue, which has now been either partially mitigated or totally mitigated, will fall down further in the list. Yes? And I have a bunch of columns that I always use. Actually, I just made a new one. I've integrated the fields of CVSS 3.1 into an Excel template because CVSS 3.1, it has some problems, but it has a really good way of asking. So the way CVSS handles the likelihood impact is they have a series of questions. You answer, can I access this from the network or does it require physical access, right? That's one of the questions that leads into likelihood, right? And they also do cover, is there an exploit and all this, right? But so they have one set of questions, which is the base CVSS score, which is how bad is this vulnerability if there were no mitigations and no mitigating context, right? How bad is it by itself? If I don't know anything else, what's the default badness? That's the base CVSS score. And then they have these environmental values and temporal values, which get added to this later. And temporal means time. I'm not trying to be fancy. That's what they call it. So environmental values are like, they take the context into effect or into consideration. So if like, oh yeah, I can leak all this data out, but actually I don't care about that. I don't care about that data really. So it's like dumping all the data out could be a more serious base score. But then in the context, you can say, okay, it's a serious bug, but it's what they get out of it we don't actually care about, right? So you can discount it there. Or you can say that data is extra sensitive and you can jack it up, right? That's the environmental values. And then in addition to that, there's the temporal values. And the temporal values are things that change with time. And there's really only a couple fields in there. So they made it way too fancy sounding. But the main thing that's in there is how advanced is the exploit? Is there no exploit in the wild? Is there a exploit in the wild that's not published? Or is the exploit in the wild with is there a proof of concept in GitHub? Or is there a stable exploit? There's kind of like 4 levels of how easy is it to just like click and own with this particular issue?
I don't know about 3 and 4 there, but yeah, okay.
Well, I don't remember what the actual values are. You can look it up.
Yeah.
So I think it's first.org is the and they have an online
First.org
CVS.
is awesome. Yes.
First.org has an online CVSS 3.1 calculator. So they will explain all of the fields in CVSS correctly, unlike what I just did. And you can play with it yourself and you can see how it works. But the base score is the score with no mitigations, no environmental factors factored in. The modified score is with the environmental mitigation stuff factored in. But it's kind of a little bit funky. But if you're gonna get used to it, it actually is a standard way of scoring vulnerabilities. And if everybody's kind of using the same standard, you end up with more normalized data across. If you have to combine multiple threat models, for example, and you made everybody use CVSS. Well, then everyone's numbers will be in the same plane, Yeah. You're like, otherwise everyone's going to make up a completely new scoring system every time they make a table.
Yeah, small tangent. Like I'm running CPTC right now, the Collegiate Penetration Testing Competition, and if you're playing and you use an established standard like CVSS, you will do much better rather than just making up your own methodology because it's something that you can prove and you can point back to, and you have exactly like you were talking about, like impact versus likelihood, and it's all calculated into that score. And then your highest issues rise to the top, and that's what the execs see, right? Like that's what really matters.
Yeah. So I made a version of my. So I have my likelihood table. I made an Excel table. What I'm using now, I have the actual columns for CVSS in there, and the Excel table calculates the base score for me, calculates the modified score for me. But then since it's in the table, I can sort. I can just sort by the modified score, and I can see, that's the thing I should be worried about right now. Well, because the thing with risk assessment in general. Right. And the whole purpose of doing threat modeling is because you have finite resources that can be allocated in defense. It's prioritization. Exactly. You have finite resources that can be deployed to defend yourself. And you want to make sure that those resources are deployed against the most likely or most dangerous threats. Or if threats are likely and dangerous, you're in a lot of trouble.
Dangerously likely threats.
Dangerously likely threats are the worst, the worst kind.
Yeah, no.
And
The only point that I want to add here for
Yeah.
the listeners that are not, for the listeners that are not necessarily new to this process, but are trying to weigh the merits of going through the labor of actually defining CVSS scoring for manually sourced threats. The actual real benefit that I see from doing that type of effort, front loading that, is that it plug and plays into your vulnerability management system. Even if it's not your program, you're not involved, you don't have a relationship with that team, it doesn't matter. The data's all there. They can do risk prioritization on your behalf. They can properly drive closure for the things that matter. The human found issues will bubble to the top regardless of how noisy a CVSS feed they already have or whatever threat intel feeds they're consuming, right? So that's to me, if for anyone else who's listening in there who actually has a security program that they participate in, why should I go through the work of CVSS scoring for my homegrown vulnerabilities I identified on a pen test? So you can actually get them fixed, so they can actually get prioritized with everything else. That's why.
Yeah. So I like to also like the CVSS score. I'll include in like the Jira ticket too. It's like the one thing that comes out of this spreadsheet. Like maybe you have a link to the spreadsheet in the Jira ticket also, but the CVS score is like the number. It's the total severity ranking, right? It's the standard measurement of how bad something is, and it's not perfect. It's definitely everything's a little fidgety in this space, or futzy or something. It's a little bit hand wavy,
Mhm.
But the other thing that I like to do, so I do love these tables. And the way that I get the tables made. So this is the thing that drives me crazy about this, the Shostack threat modeling book. Sorry, Adam. So he did a really good job of describing kind of this methodology they came up with at Microsoft that works fairly well at Microsoft, but it works at Microsoft not because it's doing what it's like threat modeling, just because it's getting developers to do things they should have been doing anyway under a strange pretense. But the really bad effect of this is that people go and read that book and they're like, oh, Microsoft does it this way. And they can't really think it through, they don't know what problems they're going to run into. And they're just like, they go back to their company and they say, we're going to do it exactly the way Microsoft did it. Yeah, because this is the big holy book on the subject of threat modeling. And they then try to do the Dataflow diagram thing, and until they run into a dead end and realize this isn't doing what they need it to do, right? They're making people do a bunch of busy work. They're not getting any useful data out of it. Everyone gets annoyed, and everyone then decides that threat modeling is stupid because that was threat modeling, and therefore we shouldn't do threat modeling anymore. And I've seen this happen multiple times, which is why I was very excited to do an episode on threat modeling. So literally the last time I saw this happen was last week. I was sitting in on another security professional who was doing a security training, and he had he had some slides on threat modeling, and he's mostly a web guy. It was like web security stuff. And for web stuff, if you're just doing web, if it's not that complicated, you can kind of just use the OWASP top 10 as sort of an out-of-the-box threat model. Daniel's shaking his head at me.
No.
But honestly, it's most of a web threat model. It's just missing your context, right? So you could like start with the OWASP top 10 and just be like, do any of those apply to me? How much do I care or whatever? But for web apps, it's like unless you're doing something strange, a lot of the threats are the same, right? It's your specific context that your new things, your things that are unique. Those are the things that need to be threat modeled, right? Like if you're just worried about SQL injection, you can write SQL injection in your threat model if you have mitigations for it, or if you're just worried about the risk for some reason because you're trying to do multi-tenancy with a database or something. You might need to worry about SQL injection in a special way in your context. But if you're just SQL injection generically, you don't necessarily need to worry about. But this whole thing. So the guy doing the training, he did the exact thing. He's like, well, I went to this company and we were doing threat modeling, and we sat in 16 hours of meetings and everyone just argued. And at the end of it, like nothing happened. And it's like that was threat modeling, and therefore threat modeling is bad, right? So I'm gonna give you some really good advice for how to practically do this. You can do this in 2 hours. So the goal, not two contiguous hours. That's the trick. But so the goal is to minimize the amount of time that you require large, expensive groups of people to be in meetings, especially meetings that will make them hate each other.
Yes.
And you and themselves.
Yes.
So in order to avoid causing real human suffering, I dispense to you this hard-earned wisdom. This is how my hair turned gray learning this. So this is what I do. So in order to threat modeling, and I tell everyone this the whole time, over and over and over again, because everyone, when you start talking about things that could go wrong, or risks, or potential things that could be bad, people start pointing fingers and blaming each other. You say, I can break this way, and someone gets defensive, and they're like, oh, well, that's not my fault. That was Bob. He's not even here anymore. He did that, or whatever, right? Or they're like, Fred over there did it. Like, yell at Fred, right? And things devolve very quickly, okay? So, like, there is no blame. This has to be an almost dispassionate discussion of probabilities, right? But the way I frame it is, I say it's a brainstorming session. There are no bad ideas. Everything that anyone thinks of needs to be written down in the threat model, even if you give it a low score, even if it's totally impossible, even if the likelihood is so close to zero, you think there's no way this will ever happen. If somebody has the thought, you don't argue with them about it. It's a brainstorming session. You write it down, you put it in the threat model, and you brainstorm all the threats first from all of the stakeholders. You gather all the people that would know anything about things that could go wrong. You have one meeting up front with the stakeholders. Sometimes it's an hour. I can do it in half an hour because I talk fast sometimes if I have a lot of coffee. So like you spend a half an hour, you get the stakeholders together, you show them your threat model template, you fill out one row as an example so they all see it happen, right? This is the description of the issue. This is how I fill out the likelihood. This is how I fill out the impact. This is how we write in the mitigations. You know, they might have other columns that they want. For whatever reason. Sometimes because of certain regulatory things, they want confidentiality, integrity, and authenticity, availability. Crap, the CIA model, right? But they sometimes they want CIA, sometimes they want CVSS. You know, depending on what they have to deal with on their back end. You know, they might have some feedback on the actual columns, but basically, you get everyone together. You say, this is what we're doing. We're doing brainstorming. We're not going to argue about anything. Okay. We're just going to come up with as many ideas as we can and fill out as many rows as we can. Okay. And first you just write in the descriptions of all the rows. And then later, once people are running out of ideas, then you go through and score them. Right. You don't even need to finish scoring them in that meeting. You just start scoring them. And then what you say is, all the stakeholders, now that you've seen it happen, and we've done most of the work already right here, right? You're going to go away for a week, and we're going to have another meeting in a week and a half, same people. And we're all going to take that time on our own to fill out whatever other things we want, right? I put it in a Google Doc, or Google Sheets, you know, everyone can edit it, not looking at each other, pants optional. But they can take time with it, right? It's because I don't know if you've noticed, but you tend to think of things that could go wrong at very strange times, you know, like when you're doing other things, when you don't want to think about things that could go wrong. That's when some part of your brain's like, hey man, have you considered the inevitability of your own demise? No.
Jesus.
Waiting for groceries, are we? Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So okay. So it's the 2 meeting thing. We have the 1 meeting. We explain it. We do a few rows. Everyone gets the gist. Then we say, hey, go. It's brainstorming. You know, no wrong answers. Just low scores. Right. You send everyone home. they'll pick a few more off during the week. Maybe they have follow-up questions they got to go ask somebody, whatever. Everyone goes off, does their own thing, come back. You have one final meeting at the end. You touch base. You go through. Everyone goes through what everyone else wrote. And you resolve duplicates for the most part. You merge a few things together. And you just sort of review the scores and you say, hey, does this look right to everybody? And if it does, bam, you sort on severity. And then you're like, how much money do we need to ask the management for? Right? Like, because that's what it is. This is the thing that you show them, that you say, I need money. Then this is how much money and this is why. Right? It's very important. And I've seen security programs choke to death over budget because they could not communicate risk upstream at all. Right? And so, like, if you want to have a company that has an internal security program, they need to be funded. But in order to fund them, you need to convince the people with the money that it's a good idea. And they don't understand how exploits work. They probably don't even really use computers that often. I'm not really sure where upper management people come from, but it's like not. I don't know. It's some other segment of the planet I don't visit. So like, or maybe it's a different planet. Oh, I never thought this through. Maybe the reason they seem like aliens is okay. All right, never mind. So the other thing I like to do, so that's kind of like my approach to doing the actuarial tables. The other thing I like to do is attack graphs. And attack graphs are there. If you Google attack graph, someone claims they made it up at some point, and there's a paper and everything. And the way they do attack graphs is like top to bottom, and I think that kind of hard to read. So I basically do an attack graph that goes left to right. And on the left, I have it's another circle and arrow diagram. But what an attack graph can help demonstrate is if you have a situation where there are multiple different paths to attack a particular target, it's sometimes good to have more of the flow chart of all of the different paths, all of the different hops that need to be taken on all the different paths to get from the attacker's starting point to the attacker's ultimate goal. So I have a node on the left, or a circle on the left, that is the attacker's starting point, and I have a circle on the far right, which is the ultimate goal of the attacker. And then there's all of the intermediate hops they have to make in the middle, and all of the arrows between them. And what that is really good for is if there are complicated attack scenarios and you are trying to explain why you need a particular mitigation. If you have an attack graph with multiple different attack pathways in it, what you see is choke points. You see that multiple different paths in have to go through the same place at some point in the middle, and then you know that is the cheapest place to put a mitigation. If I put a protection in this one place, I break up all 5 of these attacks coming in, right? And I really, really love attack graphs. They're very simple. They're very powerful. And I highly recommend them. And they are also for communicating to management. They are for communicating very complicated things to management, because management can follow circle to arrow, and management can see that multiple arrows that all the paths go through this one circle in the middle. So even if they have no idea what else you're talking about, they will get out of this that if they invest money on that one circle in the middle, they're getting like 5 times the savings, right? And that is the point you need to get across. Okay, right? And sometimes it's in one of these that I did, the common node ended up being Bluetooth, and it was like, well, we kind of don't own that. That's a thing that we bought from somewhere that we're forced to use, right? Like, so
Add extensions to it.
Yeah, we'll do another episode on Bluetooth. If I start the Bluetooth rant, we're not coming back to threat modeling, guys.
We're not.
So
No.
that's the end. That's the end of my. That's most of my spiel. I might have some more details later, but I'm super interested in what you guys think about it. So let's go to Dan, because he's been frantically waving at me.
My methodology is actually super similar. I think one of the big differences is like, when they go to brainstorm, I really like this thing called a threat-informed defense, and it only really works for like established fields, or you know what I mean, like things where you actually have a lot of threats. But if you use like Uber as an example, you look at all the different attacks that are happening, and they could be, there's different classifications of attacker, right? Like, are they defrauding drivers? Are they scraping incentives off of the market by, creating driver rider pairs? Or are they like APT and they're going to get in and steal PII? Or are they trying to extort you in some way? So I like to take all these different examples, and then you break those guys down and you say like, all right, what are their techniques? And it kind of gets into like not threat modeling, but like threat emulation a little bit, where you're like, what will they do and what controls do those attack? And then you just put those into your graph that you're talking about. And now you have like really good models of real world attacks that like people would use against your machine or your process or whatever.
Yeah, so threat modeling is valuable for attackers as well as defenders. In fact, you do the exact same operations. You say, what's the easiest thing to exploit, and how much do I win if I exploit that thing? Which is exactly likelihood and impact. I'm just looking at it from the other side, right? And attack graphs are also valuable for attackers, because when you have an attack that has like 8 different steps in it, honestly, you can't remember the beginning at the end. Yeah, shortest path too, and also what's easiest, because and that's the flip side. As a defender, you look at the threat model and you have to assume everyone is always going to go for the easiest thing to go for, right? Like, because they're going for an objective, not just like street cred, although some people do go for the hardest thing for street cred, but that's very rare, and you usually don't have to worry about them because they're usually Ilya. But hi, Ilya. Anyway, so yeah, he's harmless, but he's it might be in your machine, but he's fine. So like yeah. Sorry, he's the guy who like, well, he wrote a Minix exploit when he found out there were still 2 Minix boxes on the internet. It's like, I love that guy. Anyway, so but in general, like threat modeling is like, so we called it the actuarial model. Actuaries, if you don't know, are people that made a very safe decision in life to get a math degree. And actuarial math is like the only math degree where you're guaranteed to get a paying job out the other side. Although that was before cryptocurrency, so maybe that's not true anymore. Now you could just go, I know blockchain and I have a math degree, and I guess people give you money, or you can go work for a hedge fund. I might be out of date, but so in the old way of viewing the world, an actuary, like you get an actuarial math degree, which is like applied math, and then you go work for an insurance company, and it's a safe degree to get because you'll always be able to get a job, right? And at the insurance company, because man, when insurance goes away, like civilization is over. That's one of those things, like anyway, but so you work at the insurance company, and what you do is you compile tables of risk, right? You figure, like, if you're doing health insurance, you compile actuarial tables based on data of like how old people are when they die in various categories, or how old they are when they get like certain illnesses, and what the odds of that are. And why the insurance company cares is because risk to the insurance company is paying out benefits, right? And their whole goal is to make sure that they're collecting enough in premiums that they will be able to pay out benefits.
The insurance company cares because they're the house, and the house has to win.
Well, the house always has to win, but the house also can't run out of money. Yeah. Right. Granted, there's also secondary insurance companies which insure insurance companies, and I think it's insurance companies all the way down or something. Yeah. I don't really know how that works either, but
yeah.
So, I've often wondered why. I wish more actuaries would run for public office, to be honest, because
that would be awesome.
Yeah, but they don't. So awesome. They don't, because they play it safe, because that's who they are. They know what the odds. They know what the odds are, and they don't want to fight the odds because they're actuaries. That's that's like their whole thing is about understanding, quantifying risk, and minimizing it. Yeah. So like,
that's a good point.
They would be awesome public servants.
Really would.
But there's just because like literally there's no emotion, it's just data. We'll look at the data. We'll make cold calculations about risk and outlay, and then we'll act accordingly, right? But there's probably something to like politicians being risk-seeking people in a certain extent that's led to some of our current problems. But anyway, So, but the attack graph thing is sometimes called kill chains. So when people do it as attackers, you might hear that called kill chains. So if you Google for kill chains, there's like one paper on attack graphs from way back, but there's a lot more stuff on kill chains. But kill chains are a little bit less formal and more focused on like red teams organizing their thoughts. But you do show that to management later, but it's usually like, here's how you lost. Give us money. That's the red team. That's the red team side of it. So threat modeling is like a shift left thing, right? You're trying to talk to the dev team as early in the cycle as possible. You're trying to kind of review their design and you discuss with them, what the risks are and what they should worry about going forward in implementation.
I was gonna say, then the kill chain and the red team is a good way to like show that value, or like, if you're having people have a hard time buying it, you know what I mean? Like you can demonstrate it practically and be like, here's how I actually executed this, and here's where you can put those controls along that attack graph to stop them.
So Daniel, how do you do it?
I mean, there are a lot of similarities. I think one of the things, like for me, it's mostly trying to automate away a lot of the simpler stuff. So like you were saying, well, you're limited in that you're only able to model cloud environments. And I think there's enough automation now for a lot of organizations that that's not the case. You can leverage other automation scripts to have a pretty good idea and model a lot of things, more than just the cloud. And so the goal ultimately ends up being how many threats are really just canned based on, the label types that you apply to all the objects in your model, right? So you're generating models from the infrastructure that you can model, and then based on the context that you can apply to that model programmatically, you automatically derive a set of threats just by default before a human writes anything. And that's, again, it's just time savings, right? And the other benefit of that too is that there's an additional dimension, like while you were describing or articulating scenarios where you have to get people to participate, right? It's like, how do I get them to take their medicine? In the scenario where you're programmatically deriving a lot of it, it's kind of like you have, like, in effect, I get to go to everybody and say, you have to say this isn't true. Like I've already sourced all the data. This is all the intel I was able to collect. You have to tell me why my automation was inaccurate, which is a much stronger position to engage participation. I've found in my experience than starting from the blank sheet. That doesn't mean that the way in which you were describing how you actually capture the threats, all of the metadata involved, the actual like calculations you're trying to perform, all of that is in line. It's just a question of how much how much context can I pull from the system without ever having to talk to a human, and that's where I've been trying to push a lot for myself and for the threat modeling programs that I've been working on. Is just like I don't. It's not that I I like people just fine, but 9 times out of 10 they don't remember how the thing works. It's changing faster than they're really ever keeping track of anyway. Like the more that we can actually automate it, the more accurate it ends up being. And the the shining city on the hill that I keep trying to push towards is evergreen artifacts, right? Like you want to get to a state where your infrastructure produces the artifacts that you want without necessarily humans having to be involved, or at least get you a long way there so that people get to do, carry it the last little bit, and then you can store it off in some system of record for reference.
I mean, that's a great goal, right? But if you look at what the actual state of automation is for security stuff, right? Like most of the automation that people have is very, very limited, and a lot of it only addresses common vulnerabilities, common risks, but not the highest severity ones for the most part. I'll give you an example. Things you can do in a CI/CD stage easily are pretty limited, right? You can refuse to allow a commit that like doesn't compile without warnings, and that'll actually catch a lot of buffer overflows or integer overflow situations if you have strict warnings enabled and you're using a native language. And if you don't know what any of those words are, don't worry about it. Like Java programmers. Anyway, so the yeah. So but you have strict warnings on, and then you don't allow people to commit anything that compiles with warnings. Cool, you can do that in a CI/CD stage. In a CI/CD stage, you can also scan for entropy. You could be like, oh, are people checking passwords in? There's some things like get all secrets or whatever that can run as a CI/CD stage.
Detect secrets.
Detect secrets. Thank you. That's the better one.
Put out there, yeah.
Well, Get All Secrets is one that I like that's a little bit older. It calls Trufflehog under the hood and 2 other tools. Trufflehog you can also just run by itself as a CI/CD stage. It just Get All Secrets adds some word lists to it that Trufflehog doesn't have.
Yeah.
But these are all things that work. But static analysis is a little bit more beefy than just strict warnings. Just a little bit more. So you can do static analysis, but you can't really do static analysis in a CI/CD stage because you're usually only looking at the diffs. The diff that got checked in. You're not looking at the whole source code together, right?
No, you do static analysis at build. You do static analysis as part of build, right? Because the build you don't immediately deploy the build. But you can produce a build, you can store the artifact, you can have all the associated test data, and then it can go through the change management and release management process.
Yeah, some systems work.
And then like if you wanted to get back to a CI/CD state, right? What you're actually doing is you're saying, what are all of the metrics that I can derive from?
Well, let me give you a concrete example. Okay. So Fortify cannot run as a CI/CD stage. It is not a theoretical.
It was not designed to.
Exactly. It is not a theoretical problem. It's that there isn't a product that works that way.
Yeah.
Right. So like, we could rewrite Fortify, but no, don't wanna. Right. And check marks. Same deal. Check marks.
Do that. Right. Yeah.
Well, the problem with static analysis is that it never finds good bugs, and it never really finds bugs all the way.
Incredibly high, yeah.
Well, but the thing is like all it actually produces is false positives, but the value that it has is as a developer, I love check marks. As a security auditor too, I love check marks. Even though it's never once found a bug, it's never once found a bug for me. But when it starts complaining about certain regions of code, and I go look at those regions of code, I always find bugs there. So I never, the bug that checkmarks thinks is there is never the bug, but there's usually a bug nearby. And I don't know exactly why that is, but it's a type of automation that's not full automation. It still requires a human, right? It produces too many false positives to run in a CI/CD stage, and it always will. And so when you're talking about automation, I think practically speaking, it's like when I'm talking about threat modeling, the things that you need to threat model are always the weird context. It's always like the weird stuff that people are doing. If people are doing something that's
you never fully automate the human that way. That was not my point. My point is that you try to keep the human focused on the uncommon things, so that you like all the commoditized stuff. It should be automatable. Is the point?
Yeah, right? Totally. Well, so I mean,
wasting too many human cycles on the repetitive stuff. That actually you have the inverse effect. You make your security program dumber over time instead of making them smarter over time.
But you still need to you still need to capture those types of mitigations in your threat model. If you have an all-up threat model for the company, for example, you could have a row in the threat model that's like, we worry about secrets in source code, but we don't worry about it very much, because we have implemented detect secrets as a CI/CD stage, as in the mitigation column, right? So the description is, we worry about secrets in source, and the likelihood is very low, because in the current mitigations column, you're like detect secrets as a CI/CD stage, so we're pretty sure we're mostly covered here.
This was the threat modeling episode. If we want to go down the static analysis path, then I'm immediately going to jump to like code QL and figuring out how we can in fact capture, right? How we actually can in fact capture representations of specific types of bugs and have incredibly accurate detection capability.
No, but the problem is any static analysis based on abstract syntax trees is not is always going to have the same problem. It doesn't matter what new code word you make up to describe your project. Like
No,
there's a theoretical problem with static analysis. Dynamic analysis is an alternative, right? And the problem with static analysis is that the code isn't the truth. People think the code is the truth, but those are people that don't understand how compilers work, or operating systems, or shared memory, or networks, or device drivers, or firmware, or the BIOS, or UEFI, or SMM, and so on. Right? So like the problem is there are bugs that you can't see in code because
that's not, I agree with you, but I also would argue that that's not what static analysis is designed to identify anyway, right?
Well,
what everything that you've just described, right, and all of the weaknesses in the stack that someone's building on top of, what that does is invalidate all of the bad assumptions that may have been made that went into designs that specific, behaviors were considered blessed by the automation. So like, for example, if they deemed, well, static credentials is a false positive because you're never going to get to the source file for some reason because I have just the best stack ever, right? Like what you've just described is invalidating really terrible assumptions that go into the configuration of static analysis that result in certain issues being suppressed, not necessarily saying that static analysis itself is fundamentally flawed, right? It's still the text.
It's fundamentally weak.
Sure.
It's exactly. Fundamentally there are problems
by
with
itself incomplete.
By looking at the parsed abstract syntax tree of source code, you cannot find all errors. You cannot even find all sources. You cannot find all syncs. You don't know what data is important in your context. And that is what threat modeling gives you that static analysis does not. But further, deeper than that, static analysis spits out so many false positives, you cannot trust it in a fully automated place like a CI/CD stage. So that's it's like I'm all for automation. I'm all for working towards greater automation in the future. I just don't quite like human context and humans' understanding of context. It's like the data is important only because it's important to humans. To the computer, your PII is the same as your, zip code or your porn collection. Like the computer does not care. It's just bits. Yeah. Anyway, so Justin is asleep with his eyes open.
No, I'm here.
Well, great. So have we lulled you into a stupor?
No, actually, a couple.
Yeah, well, I'm really interested in did all of this make sense to you, or what didn't make sense?
Oh yeah, it totally makes sense. Actually, recently, so I was handed an Excel workbook and asked to make a data flow diagram. And the Excel workbook was really awesome, and it had all the columns. It had a vector. It had
CSS vector or attack vector.
Yeah, attack vector, like anyone on the internet or like someone on the intranet.
Yeah.
Had risk like super elite hacker or public exploit or like
those are the likelihood fields.
Yeah, likelihood, all that stuff. So it was great. It had multiple tabs, as very well written out explanations. And then when it came to the data flow diagram, like I had virtually no knowledge of the infrastructure of the company and or the code. And getting information from the devs was virtually impossible because they're busy coding like all the time. So like I could send an email out, and maybe get a response the next day, maybe. And so like it took forever, and then there's all these missing pieces. So it was like the whole concept that type of data flow diagram is pointless makes a lot of sense to me. But Dan and I were talking the other day, or he was talking to me actually, about the C4 model. And he was showing me some stuff about it, and I thought that was like super cool. That looked like
is that when beating the printer with a baseball bat just isn't enough?
Yeah, pretty much. So C4 is someone decided that they were tired of the lack of consistency in diagrams, so they decided to create more rules for how diagrams should conform,
But
which I'm sure no one is
before you
ever going
talk
to
about
follow.
that,
That's
I
what
wanted
the
to ask
world
you
needs
one
is
thing.
more rules. I've always said
Hey!
that.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're going to talk about that before you go into that, I wanted to ask you one question. So, talking about like, I really dig the concept of the automation and everything generating its own documentation, or for lack of a better
Where
word,
possible, like
where possible.
they're always gonna, it's never 100%, but it gets like, it again, the whole thing is just trying to save cycles, man. Like,
Right. So
asking
my
a
main
human to do
question
everything
is
is the
like,
problem.
how does that best happen from actual code, like that the at the code level, like for web applications or something, as opposed to higher levels where it made more sense to me that it could automate itself. Like, is it the documentation of the code, or how do you make the code itself
Yeah, that's a
generate
really good
information?
question. Yeah, so like, like getting before it's one of the things that I always laugh every single time somebody gets into threat modeling or security programs fresh for a new environment, is that like security is an extension of quality. So there's all these additional qualitative measures that need to happen, just maturity to the development practices before security even gets the needle even gets to move. Otherwise, like, and case in point, the reason why the majority of small teams end up investing in things like endpoint protection and random other pizza boxes that they get to plug into things is because that's the thing that moves the needle the fastest before they can figure out how to actually get their hooks into the SDLC, actually get the hooks into changing developer behavior, right? I think Virus has different opinions about this, but from my perspective, I feel like
We'll
I
never
feel like
know.
that's where I feel like that's where, that's why people end up getting biased to doing that, right? Is that it's a lot harder for them to figure out how to get traction within changing the culture of the engineering group within a given business that they're participating in. So, but yeah, like case in point, yeah, how do you get to a stage where you can start generating everything? Like you need to start creating, development standards. You have to start defining. You can start introducing things like linters, introducing things like document generators. You can introduce things like, testing frameworks. But you can only do that once you actually have, a coalition of the willing, right? Like you're not going to be able to just like force that onto the development group. You have to sell them on why that makes their lives easier, their lives better.
So Dan has
Yeah.
something to say, but real quick? What's the best model you've seen so far for the automation of actual code, auto generating artifacts or information that could be put into a threat model?
I mean, I've built this type of a system twice at very large organizations, and both times it was homegrown. Like I'm not aware of open source projects that exist right now that would be out of the box. But if someone were to start going down that path, it would be, the places like the type of well-structured data they would be taking advantage of are things like, CloudFormation, Terraform, Spinnaker.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was my
And
comment. I was going to say, when you were talking about infrastructure as code, like Terraform came right to the front of my mind. And yeah, that has a built-in graphing function, or you could use a tool like Blast Radius to like visualize how all those components go together, which is maybe like the attack graph stuff or the network models.
What
Maybe you
is
could like
Blast
lay one
Radius,
over
Dan?
that.
Yeah, blast radius and is related to attack graphs. Attack graphs are really good for doing blast radius, and in fact, I have generated. I made a tool for a company once that was basically it took Nessus scans for every instance in the company, and then just if Nessus found critical things, it would make the node red or whatever, and if it found nothing, it would make it green, and if it found just medium stuff, it would make it yellow or whatever. And then I actually went into the software-defined networking for all of the instances, and I pulled out all of the connectivity information, right? Which service talks to what other service on what port. And this company had like a fabric thing. Everything was MTLS tunnels to everywhere. It was kind of good actually in that respect. But so I knew where all of the machine instances were. I knew how to color them with what vulns they had, And then I knew how they were all connected, and I put that all into a D3 graph. And then you could do queries like of the form, I have exploits for this vuln, this vuln, and this vuln. Show me the blast radius, right? And it would go into the graph, and it would drop out all of the nodes that didn't have an exploitable issue in one of those bugs, and it would show you like all of the nodes you could hit by the transitive closure of some collection of exploits. And they were very happy with that as a concept, but they ultimately did not like the result. Mostly because they were like, I was like, yeah, I can basically own everything, and they were like, well, you should fix your visualization then. And I was like, no, that's never mind. Have your threat models lost their turn on the threat walk? Call the hacker helpline. 206-486-6272. I just did that to see Daniel die inside.
You can certainly map.
Oh my god! Oh my god! It was so good.
Let it go. We made
It's such a
we made it
bad
through a
line.
whole fucking episode without that shit. You still worked it in.
Look, having right said Fred stuck in your head is still better than relax, don't do it stuck in your head.
Do you feel like this episode is missing an important perspective? Have your own threat modeling, success, or horror stories you'd like to share? Is there anything at all in this episode that makes you want to give us a piece of your mind? Call the Hacker Helpline at 206-486-6272, that's 206-486-NARC, or send an audio email, or maybe even just a regular old plain text email, to podcast@symbolcrash.com.
A wild virus has appeared. Hey, we are joined by virus.
Am I supposed to talk now?
Once again?
I said, am I supposed to talk now?
Yeah. Well, we were waiting for you to work out your audio.
Yeah.
'Cause you're kind of garbly.
I had to change a bunch of stuff. I'm sorry. This entire conversation is very triggering, having done M&A for a while.
So, murders and assassinations. Basically, when you do that as a security guy, you go into some startup that some other company's considering buying, and you
Justify the discount.
yeah,
A $7 billion company.
and you earn your damn salary.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, it's not a startup. It's a $7 billion company that's also publicly traded, but that's a whole other story.
It's a $7 billion startup.
That's what I heard.
Yeah. You want to be a real company? You act like a real company. I'll call you a real company. How about that?
Yeah, I don't know. My like standing gripe with the general philosophy behind, I'll just call it issue triage, because it's really the same shit, right? If we're talking about bug bounties or threat modeling, it's all the same crap. It's how do you decide what's a bug and how do you decide what bugs are important? And security type hacker people who are legitimately smart people like genuinely think that, well, it's simple. You just solve all of the error machine states and then this problem is solved. And that's not how the universe works at all. So the whole premise of like whether or not static analysis is better or whether or not dynamic analysis is more effective, like the answer is it doesn't fucking matter because you don't actually care about all the bugs. You only care about the important bugs. And if we're talking about a company perspective, the important bugs are the ones that cost you money. And it turns out most bugs don't actually cost you money. And this is like a real, like, I empathize with this because, like, as a slightly aspy person myself, I also am like, but there's a bug. But, like, no, most of the bugs as a hacker person that you will find, no one gives a shit about because they don't actually threaten any real capital at scale, right?
Like bug bounty bugs.
Right. Well, not even bug bounty bugs. Like, the entire banking industry is a wonderful example of this, right? Like, generally speaking, of all the bugs that banking the whole banking industry cares about, they do not care about privacy bugs, like at all. Why? Because most people are not Warren Buffett. Like, you don't have that much resource in the bank. So if it gets jacked, like, you have what? Like, a couple $100,000 if you're, like, doing really well, like, in the bank? It's like your life savings? Sweet. That's, like, not even a fraction of a percentage that, like, we get from the FDIC every day. So why should we spend, as an example, like $200,000 on buying blinky boxes or humans to protect your data when by not spending that money and by spending $50,000 on just having a decent person on the phone that you can call so that we know that someone took your money?
I mean,
This is exactly why I like the actuarial method of threat modeling, right?
Yeah, I think it's full circle.
This is exactly the argument that I was going to make, is that the reason why banks are good at this has nothing to do with the quality of their security programs and everything to do with the fact that they understand actuary math. Like, and more so that there's regulatory incentive for them to actually have a balance sheet that they get to like, it's a double whammy. They hold that for regulation, and then they also hold it as a way of as collateral to offset risk. It's crazy.
It's a triple whammy. Banks are market influencers so much that they are actually a threat to other businesses that are not banks that have to do business with them.
Yeah.
Triple DES. So the American payment system. The American payment system is not yet updated to AES. They've been promising to update to AES for decades. Like, since AES has been a thing, basically. They're like, oh, we should switch to that. But instead, like, at the guts of the credit card system, there's still an implementation of triple DES, which is not even triple DES. It's like 2.5 DES, right? It's like, it's a it still gets used by, like, point of sale terminals and, like, for limited use keys and all kinds of places. And
that far into the wire to find like perfect examples of jank. Do you know what a wire transfer document is?
No.
Like, a wire transfer document, like straight up, like this, like even when you do it through the web portal, right? What's happening is that's turning into a document, and a human on the other side is doing things with that document to a bank. That is how a wire transfer works. If it's not
out before. I guess the form you fill out when you do the wire transfer, that's like the official thing, and someone just stamps it at some point.
Generally agreed upon standard. You can vote for them, because if you couldn't, how the fuck would you know how to move money from one bank to another?
Well, you know, a perfect example. Credit card. Credit cards. Credit cards are the most insecure thing in terms of.
Trust me, a wire transfer document, generally, by standard, is a PDF. That's what a wire transfer document is.
Yeah.
And there's not that many banks that play on Swift. If you know what Swift is, great. If you don't, it doesn't really matter. Most banks don't play on Swift, so they need another way. Financial partners, I won't even say banks. They need another way to do business with other financial partners and banks. So you know what the industry agreed upon standard is? SFTP. The entire fuck America.
Hold on, there's two SFTPs. Which one do you mean?
Is humans getting emails, making PDFs, and transferring them to other companies over SFTP. This is how the.
Do you mean? Wait. Do you mean the SFTP that's based on SSH, or do you mean FTP with SSL?
Yes.
Yes.
So you're required to use SFTP, but they won't tell you which one.
Correct.
Oh, they didn't realize there were two SFTPs when they wrote that as a requirement. I love this.
Incredibly common for banks. I don't mean banking partners, for banks, because it's easier for them. But they actually mandate that in order to become a partner on their platform, you are not allowed to use keyed authentication for their SFTP endpoint. You have to use a password. And they generate you the username based on your client name. So they force you to have an easily guessable cred for an SFTP server that's on the internet, that has to be on the internet, that transfers only the big dollars. So, like, we don't
Everything is awful.
Like hundreds of millions.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, but honestly, the best example of
Monopoly
banks
mode.
doing monopoly. The best example of banks doing threat modeling though
Yeah.
is credit cards. Really, it's it's definitely credit cards. So since the beginning, I mean, checks had this problem too, right?
Cards.
What?
Payment cards.
Yeah, credit cards, debit cards, checks had this problem too. People used to
Payment cards. Credit cards are a tiny, tiny, tiny category inside the giant cloud that is payment cards. I could have a show about
I literally don't give a shit. But I was surprised to find out, for example, that 1 year I looked at PayPal's data. They did like 26 billion in business, and they lost $1 billion to fraud.
That's
But
great. That's not bad at all.
it's great. They were super happy, but they were like, "Oh, this is considered great for financial things to only lose less than 5% to fraud. Great, that's amazing, right?"
Less than 5%.
But the thing with credit cards, right, is they take a 5% rip on basically every transaction, and that gives them a huge buffer of money for which to absorb fraud.
To be extremely clear, like there's like 30 different parties inside that 5%. It's not like your credit card provider takes 5%. Like, yeah, they take 5% in the same way that like, your store vendor takes X percentage of whatever they sell you out of the convenience store, but like the supplier, the transport, that like there's like trust me, my day job is working for a payment processor. Like I can tell you all day long about how like that.
Yeah, but whatever the ultimate percentage is, that goes back to the people that have to cover the fraud, that have the actual financial liability for covering fraud, right? Whatever that percentage is that comes back to them out of every payment, they need to keep their outlay for fraud less than that number. And as it happens, say their final cut is like 1%. As it happens, less than 1% of transactions are fraudulent, so they're making crazy money, right? But that's why threat modeling is so important to them. It actually lets them figure out what things they don't need to address, or what things they can only address with a partial mitigation. Because often doing a partial mitigation gets you a bit of a gain, and often that's enough to get you by, right? And so it's literally, this is what threat modeling is about. It's about, you have limited resources, you have to determine where to deploy those resources to get the best bang for your buck. And that's all it is about, right? And it lets you do some really weird and counterintuitive crap. I'm going to hand it over to Dan because he's waving at me frantically.
Yeah, like a great example is exactly like you said, like the American credit card industry or payment cards or whatever, right? Like before they did chip and pin, they had those little CSC codes on the back, and their big bet was that fraud was going to go online, and that's how they could tell with that extra code. And they were wrong, right? Like there was all kinds of payment skimming, like people hacked into the companies and then skimmed the physical cards. So they had to, not like a recall, but it's exactly like the formula we talked at the beginning, right? Like is the trade-off for the losses greater than replacing all the cards with chip and pin? And eventually they had to replace all the cards with chip and pin.
But it doesn't even matter because you can skim EMV too. Because there's if the inverse path guys from Italy are in the Wikipedia page for EMV for their DEF CON Black Hat talk where they did an EMV card skimmer. And as it turns out, it's like not that much different than doing a mag card skimmer. And if you follow this through, this is why I was saying that payment cards. I'll accept the language correction. Payment cards, because I guess it's the payment card industry. That's what they call it, right? But like payment cards are they're inherently insecure, and they're pretty much always going to be, because it's like they've got to mass produce these things and hand them out to everyone, and then you're like walking around with it like someone could just steal it from you at any point, right? Somebody can, if they get physical access to it, they will be able to extract some data from it on some timeline at some expense. And what's more common is man-in-the-middle type things, interposing, right? So you could do like mag card skimming where you're just sort of sniffing it off, or you can do like an EMV skimmer that actually gets in between the chip that's in the card and the reader and does like a man-in-the-middle type operation where it actually does like a protocol downgrade. It says, because there's a negotiation, what types of authentication must be provided for this purchase station, right? like card, signature, pin, whatever, some combination. And you can actually, there's options and there's fungibility. So if you're coming in as a skimmer, you can say, oh, I only want to give you the ones that I have, right?
And the point here is that that's because the security of payment cards doesn't happen at the design of the card. The cards get iterated on design because it forces the quote-unquote criminal element to invest a certain amount of money in breaking the new way. And so that is a used calculation when it comes to risk coefficients at the industry worldwide. Like,
it's basically,
it's a shit about skimming because even as a criminal, even if it was like crazy, like TDMA level, back in the 90s easy, like, it's a volume thing. More people spend money than you can possibly rip off in meat space. So they just don't, like, they don't care. That's not what the point of that is. Right? And
the thing is it would not be financially practical for them to stop all fraud, even if it's theoretically possible, which I'm not sure it is. But it would require some kind of, like, everybody would need a YubiKey that, like, I don't know, reads your. I have no idea. I can't even imagine how to do a perfectly secure credit card.
To try to comment on what I believe was the original point, since I came late, right? The point here is that fraud usually is actually not the biggest dearth of fear of risk or capital for a given industry, even for companies that specialize in, like, financial transactions. Like, fraud is usually not the thing you're afraid of. Usually the thing you're afraid of, the one hit, oh God, if somebody gets those crown jewels, if somebody hits that home run, we are just fucked, are things like insider trading. And it's because you only hear about the insider trading that the SEC tells you about. What you don't hear about is that most of the time it works. Right? Insider trading scares the shit
I always figured
out of major business owners. Another thing that scares them is within a certain scale, anti-legal compliance. Anti-legal compliance scares them not because they're afraid of going to jail, not because they're afraid of their partners going to jail, not because they even give a shit about their clients, but because it'll make their partners stop doing business with them internationally. Because they have alternatives. Right? It's, well, if you're under indictment, then the cost of doing business with you goes up 5%, and that makes you as expensive as the local partner I can use in country, so why would I use you? You're greater risk. Right?
This is a perfect example. This is a perfect example of how the context of your industry affects your threat model. Right? Your unique and individual context is going to change what the risk landscape looks like to you. And that is what threat modeling is about.
Right. In technology companies, it's usually almost all of it is underpinned on like trust, some derivation of trust. For finance, it's almost entirely
nice way of saying SLA
liability.
Usually.
Yeah,
that's really what they mean.
In finance, it's almost all underpinned by liability, right? It's what they can get stuck with, what they can get pinned to.
How reasonably sure that the data I want from you is going to be the data I expect, generally untampered with, and on time? Like, that's 99.9999% of all SLAs right there. And if you extrapolate that to most of tech, that's most of your business risk right there. And like a chunk of that business risk is the threat model that security people get tasked to pay about. Like, that's everything else is
tech. Everything is SLA. Finance. Everything is legal liability.
And then, like, what people. There's also a disconnect, just to switch gears a little bit. There's a big disconnect between what your customers are worried about and what the business is worried about, usually. And so the things that make the news, right? Like the TJ Maxx hack, where a bunch of credit cards got stolen, Target got hacked, all these retailers get hacked because, oh my God, whatever. I don't even know the whole list anymore. I got it's like you could just assume basically every retail place has been hacked to the point where payment information has been stolen. And
I'm trying to play the mental game where I'm thinking of like the same like singular driving risk factor for every vertical. Like medical is also liability, but I guess like the question is, for every heavily regulated space, it's liability. So avionics, medical, finance.
Also safety Avionics has a different thing. Control systems have a different thing because safety it gets into play. And safety is like if your code fucks up, people die immediately. The plane falls out of the sky, right? Your Tesla
Manufacturing
slams,
has
your
is a
Tesla
safety
slams
thing
into a
too.
dump truck. Yeah, manufacturing absolutely, right?
Safety.
So safety is a big a special consideration for a lot of verticals. And the thing with like
I was
but the
trying
thing
to
with
think
like
of the one for
wait, wait,
commerce
wait.
though on the TJ Maxx example.
No, but what I was going to say with the TJ Maxx hacks, all the retailer hacks, Target hacks, what I found interesting about that. So those companies kind of didn't give a crap about protecting their internal networks, their payment system networks, like protecting the credit card terminals that much. And then they got hacked. You see their stock price dip for a little while, like a couple of weeks. And then everybody forgets it's in the news. It's all over the news. And then everybody kind of forgets about it. Stock price goes back up. And, maybe they fix stuff and maybe they don't.
There's also
Right?
there's reasons that
Commerce actually has no risk profile because the short-term memory loss of customers.
I'm fairly convinced that those types of breaches, they call them breaches. Those types of breaches, even serious breaches, like 100,000 credit cards stolen or whatever, or like thousands of boxes inside that company compromised, right? Like serious breaches, do not have a long-term impact on the stock price of a company. Right? So like there's a disconnect between what people care about and what companies care about, and that comes down to what the actual risk is to the company. Right? If they don't actually have real world consequences for doing something, they will not prioritize addressing that concern. And that kind of comes up with like GDPR, right? So like nobody's really sure how much to worry about GDPR yet. But then there's other companies like Google, Microsoft, who've had a habit of just being like, I'm going to straight up ignore antitrust laws and I'm just going to pay the fine. And the fine for Microsoft got fined like $500 million twice by the EU a few years apart. And they were just like, whatever. Like it's easier for us just to pay this and not worry about it than it is to try and actually address this concern to make the European Union happy. And that's a threat model right there. That's hardball risk assessment. Like up to and including like $500 million fine is fine, man. That's great.
How many zeros? Like we should be able to tie the delineation between hardball and not hardball threat modeling to a number of zeros behind the number, right? Like, is it 6 zeros? Is it 5 zeros? Where's the hardball line?
One of the first AppSec gigs I ever had.
Yeah, 7 sounds good.
One of the first AppSec gigs I ever had was I believe this is public information, which is why I think I can say it. Was a pen test for part of a PCI ROC that Polycom failed, and I believe it is public knowledge that they failed because since I have had that job 9 some odd plus years ago, they are still paying, I believe it is somewhere between $30 and $70 million a day in fines because they make enough money that they just don't give a shit about their failed ROC, and it's cheaper to just keep paying the fine than to either try to fix it or get a new one.
That's fascinating.
So this is what I mean. It's like it's cold, it's dispassionate. Yeah, hardball, man. It's cold, dispassionate assessment of risk, like actual risk. Not it's pragmatism. It's applied pragmatism, And it is it's not really that hard to do because if you're honest with yourself, everybody does it every day. In their own little, microcosm. Some people are really, really bad at it. Like some people can't seem to figure out what their actual self-interest is, but that's a different sort of, that'd be a topic for a different podcast, I imagine. But
we never really, we meandered way away from the Adam Shostack talking points on the book. Let's bring it back to threat modeling.
So one thing I wanted to say about threat modeling, and then we'll go to the book, right? One thing I wanted to say about threat modeling is when I do the hardware hacking workshop, I actually start every hardware hacking workshop with a 10-minute description of threat modeling, right? Because I say when you start doing an engagement, any kind of engagement, if you're thinking about defense, if you're thinking about offense, you want to think about what the context is, what the real world, context is for what you need to worry about for security, or what you're trying to attack and how the easiest way to attack it is, right? You want to get that in your head. You want to stay focused on your objective, because as an attacker or as a defender, you have a finite amount of resources to apply to win, right? So it's like a game of Go. And in Go, there's only one sort of piece. You have white stones, your opponent has black stones. You take turns placing them on any nexus on the board. There's no special thing about any individual piece, right? And there is a strategy in the game of Go, which probably has a Japanese name that I don't know. But there is a well-known strategy in the game of Go that every move you make, it's a game of efficiency. Yeah. You have the same number of moves as your opponent. You have the same exact tools as your opponent. How you deploy them is all that matters. And whoever deploys their pieces more efficiently will win. And that's why it's such a great game theory example. So there is a strategy in the game of Go, which is that every move you make should have two purposes, right? And typically in Go, it's like attack and defense at the same time, right? But I really, I think about that a lot. It's like it really is just efficient deployment of limited resources. So I go over this at the hardware hacking, and I explain threat modeling. I don't go into this level of detail. I don't talk about actuarial tables. I don't talk about attack graphs. I don't talk about data flow diagrams at all, because these are like off the street beginners that I'm trying to get to hack a voting machine, just because it makes me happy to have people off the street hack voting machines for some reason. So I explained it as who, what, how, right? Who's coming for my shit? What are they coming for? How are they likely to come for it? Right? And that kind of leads into, normally when you talk about threat modeling, people talk about assets. You make a list of your assets. Those are the things you want to defend. And you also want to look at the attack surface, right? Which are all the ways an attacker could come in. Yeah? And that's kind of my kindergarten version of likelihood and impact, right? Who, what, how, think about your attack surface. Okay, start hacking this voting machine. But to bring it back to the Shostack book, I'm gonna I haven't actually read it. I've just flipped through it, but so I'm familiar with the threat modeling tool. I was kind of in the general vicinity when the initial version was written. So I kind of have a sense that the people that made this at the time, they were like trying something out. They didn't really have a solid idea what they were doing. And then it just sort of evolved and evolved. But what did you think about it?
Well, something that you said earlier triggered something for me. There was some materials that I drafted in a previous role. And it coined a concept of, it was, everything needs an acronym, right? It was called 3AC, which was actor, action, asset, condition. And that was the construct, like that we would get people being either product owners all the way down through the different levels of engineering based on seniority, start walking out user scenarios in that context, like who does what, and then like a condition, like in the condition of, right? And that was the way that we would get them to like walk through all of their user stories. It would also allow us to provide, like, it would allow us to constrain to some extent the NLP space if we wanted to process it programmatically. So that entire user story list would be a lot easier for us to operate on.
Yeah, honestly, the threat modeling tool, data flow diagram thing, if they had just had a master list of all of the things that could be circles, so that people didn't type in strings, but they selected something from a list, this is the service over here that I'm talking about, and then you select it, and then it goes in the diagram. That would improve things somewhat, because then you'd be able to stitch the threat model for each service, the data flow diagram, I mean, for each service together, right, and have a big data flow diagram. However, it's still not a threat model, right? And what makes me really sad, actually, so I forgot a couple other examples about sort of the danger of thinking that a data flow diagram is a threat model. So there's this desire, everyone needs to do threat modeling. So people have started security startups to make threat modeling tools. And what did they do when they wanted to make a threat modeling tool? Well, they got the Adam Shostack book, and they read the Adam Shostack book, and I'm sure that if you actually read the book and parse it, he says things like, this is an example of how to do it. This is what we do at Microsoft. And people are probably taking an extra step there and inferring that they should just do the same thing, or that people should always do the same thing, right? Because that's a common error that people make. Okay, so there's two tools that I've evaluated, commercial tools. One was called Threat Modeler, which is a software as a service thing, and the other one was called Irius Risk. And both of these are very similar tools, although Irius Risk is basically very difficult to use to the point of like insanity. Like if you thought the burp interface was confusing, oh man, you have no idea.
The old one or the new one?
Either one.
Never again.
Yeah. But so Irius Risk, I looked at, and it's data flow diagram based. It's basically just an extension of like the same type of thing that the Microsoft threat modeling tool is. And I also looked at Threat Modeler, which is also data flow diagram based, right? There are no, like threat modeling tools that believe that a threat model is not a data flow diagram that I'm aware of at the moment. And what makes me sad about that is this is like a whole wasted generation of technology, right? People are going to probably give them some money and try to make it use it inside their company, and they'll probably stay in business because people will forget to cancel their licenses for a few years, right? Like every other security startup, that manages to sell anything to anybody. It's like, it doesn't really matter if it works or not, because like the people at the company bought a security thing, and that means they did something for security. And as long as they, keep paying for the subscription, well, then they have paid for the security thing. So obviously they're doing their job as someone who's supposed to buy security things, right? And whether or not it actually has an impact may or may not be important, right?
Yeah.
But the Threat Modeler tool is it was a little bit easier to use. It had better graphics, but it still has the same fundamental flaw. It requires people to do even more work up front. Like you'd have to hire somebody whose job it would be just to fill out data flow diagrams in Threat Modeler. For Irius Risk, you'd probably have to hire 10 people. And you probably have to, like, one of them would be able to figure out how to do it, and then you'd fire the other 9, right? Like, it's really confusing in there, man. But
wild.
But I think part of the reason is that you cannot compete with Excel, right? Like, spreadsheets are just intuitive. Everyone knows how to use them. Google Sheets is free, software as a service, all that. And I guess if you have corporate Google, it's in there. But if you have like 365 or something, you could use Excel. It's the same difference, right? And it does not require any extra software, and it's using technology from the 80s. And I think that's why no one likes it, right? Like when I try and pitch this to people in companies, I'm like, we should really just be using a spreadsheet. It's a lot easier. It makes everyone less upset. It allows you to capture risks more accurately, and the mitigations are right there next to the risk. You can see what's going on in one place, and you can be done in 2 hours total, right? But there's no way to sell me a thing that based on this, right? Like I can't have a startup that's like selling you a spreadsheet because everyone already has a spreadsheet, So I think that this cottage industry has a perverse incentive to continue to convince people that threat models are data flow diagrams, right? And they're just not. Sorry.
Well, again, I think you're in my opinion, I think you're conflating multiple things. I think that building automation to be able to effectively consume all of the data sources that you have in an organization model that, and then derive a variety of different outputs. One of those outputs can be the Excel document that everybody works on for doing prioritization, actuary-based analysis of every single threat that you identified in a system. Another one can be a data flow diagram for the parties in which that would provide value. Is that going to be your engineers? No. Like it'll be some auditor who comes in and wants to look at a specific picture, right? Like it's not necessarily about.
I wasn't talking about automation at all, and I'm really in support of data flow diagrams. I'm just saying that a threat model is a different thing. A threat model is a risk matrix. A threat model is a risk matrix. It's a risk matrix.
Matrix. Yeah.
It keeps track of what your risks are, what your identified risks are, and what the state of mitigation is for each of them. And it gives them a score where you know which one is worse than another one, right? Yeah. And that is the minimum viable threat model right there. And the fact is that those data flow diagram threat modeling tools do not give you that. They do not give you a way of asking your boss for more money. And therefore, they have no value to me, right? Like the purpose of a threat model is to fund your security department.
Quote for the episode.
The purpose of your threat model is to fund your security department. Yes.
The underpinning quote for the episode is, none of your tools help me get more money for my security program. That's the quote.
Sold. Deal.
Yeah.
This has been, none of your tools help me get more money for my security program. Brought to you by Zimblecrash. All right.
So, touching briefly on the Adam Shostack book, because we keep bouncing away from it. My kinder summary of it is that one of the my biggest gripe with the book is that it falls into the same pitfalls that a lot of security texts kind of fall into, which is when someone tries to explain one concept, they think they have to build the world around the reader in order to give them the actual idea, because somehow they're only going to be right if they have all the context along with the original point they were making. So instead of Shostack's book being about here's a threat modeling methodology, which fine, could be biased, we can debate the merits of Stride, etc. Right? It's also here's a compendium of every single type of threat that I could think about in all of these different scenarios, which is no, that compendium of text actually doesn't. It knowing what I know of individuals who have gone through the publication process, that was already long expired by the time it even went to print. The exercise of doing that and the labor that went into it, I'm sure Adam did a ton of work to do it, but it ultimately ends up providing an inappropriate sense of understanding and depth to the reader that is ultimately just it's rotten information on the shelf. They need to go out and go get that data directly from sources that are refreshed more frequently. So that's my biggest gripe with it. That book would be better, in my opinion, if it focused explicitly on the threat modeling methodology pieces alone, and that the rest of that material that it just cited and said, sent the reader to the right, sources that were more accurate, that have a faster refresh time.
I agree with that completely. I think that there is something of an impulse in the industry to generate an encyclopedia of all possible threats. And I think that's
every time it fails.
Pointless. It's
pointless.
It's a bunch of work, and it's entirely pointless because the context matters, and that is the point, right? The point is figuring out what the risk matrix is for every context that you care about, right?
You also have to understand that most of the people tasked with threat modeling are not engineers. So at a very significant level, they don't understand how the system that they're being tasked to threat model functions.
Yep.
And so
I never understand. I have to threat model things I don't understand all the time, which is why I do this. I do the 2 meeting thing. I set up one meeting with all the lead devs, and maybe I don't like to bring product people in. I don't like to bring marketing people in.
You don't want someone to sell you on what it is. You want someone to tell you exactly what it is.
I want the people who will tell me what's wrong with it. And I don't want the people who will try and talk me out of thinking that anything's wrong with it. Right?
Yes.
So anyone who talks to the customers should be nowhere near this fucking meeting. They're just going to drag it along. They're going to make it miserable because you're going to be like, if I can get a SQL injection, I can dump out all the, like every user's data and violate multi-tenancy. We'll call that a critical. And they'll be like, no, like security is our number one priority. Our customers' data is like always protected. And you're like, someone escort that dude out, right? You're in the wrong meeting, like this is not that meeting. This is a different meeting than that.
But most companies don't have the kind of resources to hire somebody with the bedside manner and engineering experience and talent to do both of those things, right? To understand the system at some level, at a very tangible level, which you can, and to know how much of that data translates to shit normal people care about. Which is why when the guy who's the product man says, well, but security is our number one priority, and when he says security, he probably means privacy, but he doesn't know that. He's not a security person.
Right.
Honestly, he's just saying whatever words will make the customer happy. He doesn't understand how anything actually works.
I mean, yes, that's possible, but like, I don't.
No, I mean, that's sales, man. That's the foundation of our economy. We have people that do things and people that sell things, and they're not usually the same people.
Unnecessarily inflammatory. Like, just Ben's over here labeling people customer parrots. Is that like?
Well, I'm just assuming. I'm assuming. Like, I've always wished I could do sales. Because I think it's more money for less work even than my job, right? So like, it's like if you were really good at sales, like right out of college, I had a friend got a gig as a sales engineer. I was making like less than 100K. He was making 250K, like right out of college. Like he was the guy. If he's listening, I'm sorry, but you copied my CS homework through school, and you know it, right? So. And I wasn't complaining at the time. I'm not complaining now. I'm just like, I was like, come on, man. Like, but literally, it's the market pays whatever. I have no idea what it is. It's like, I've wished since college that I was better at sales so I wouldn't have to do, like write all this code.
I'm saying it wrong. I'm just saying that any medium that is going to be written around the concept of threat modeling is going to have a basis in security expertise and is going to be written for people that don't understand that. And it is their job to break very legitimately complex things down that are not their ball into something that they can tell their boss tomorrow.
Yeah, it is. I agree with you, actually. I was thinking about what you were saying before responding because I was like, is that true? Because what I was thinking is threat modeling a task that you could delegate to a non-technical program manager? And I think that it is not. It almost is. It almost is, but what happens is it's like you could have someone shepherd the process. Well, let me finish. You could have someone shepherd the process, gather the stakeholders, ask them leading questions, like write everything down in the table. But ultimately, you need somebody to curate the list and know what's bullshit and know what's missing. And that's something that a non-technical program manager is not going to be able to do.
I agree, 100%. And re-ask your question.
What was my question? How do I get my security team more money?
No, it was whether or not threat modeling is something you can have
a non-technical individual. Yeah. Like a program manager or project manager.
Answer, it doesn't matter because most companies have to.
Well, then they can't really do threat modeling.
Well,
fine, but you can't really do that, right? So that's this is the reality, right? Like,
well, you could have the lead dev do it, right? But the fact of the matter is you cannot do it without somebody that has a real world understanding of the concrete details of how the thing works. And that's all there is.
Let's follow this hypothetical for the purposes of judging value of the reading material, right? So you said well then have the lead dev do it or have somebody, right? Like you're saying at the end of the day this is an inachievable.
Well, let's be honest. Lead devs usually do it.
No. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm saying okay, fine. Okay. If you're running a board or you're CEO or you're at some level responsible for the delivery of this threat model, you have a lead dev, and let's say that this lead dev, for the purposes of this hypothetical, has 0 people skills. I don't mean social skills, I mean people skills. This person is a wonderful technical savant who has no functional capability to translate the engineering reality of the system that is your product into things that matter to a human. On the other hand,
Personally attacked right now.
I'm
Personally attacked.
I am that guy. I'm not shitting on it. I'm just saying that is one reality. And another reality is you have the sales guy who went to CS class. He copied your homework through the whole thing, but
He'd be fine. I could work with him.
who do you pick to do the threat model? If you're the C-level executive, probably the sales guy. Because even if he's wrong, at least you understand what the fuck he said.
But that's a conflict of interest. You can't, like, you literally should never have your salespeople doing risk analysis. That's a critical failure. Like,
I'm going to side with Dan on this side, on this one, and say that I would love to have as much of it as self-generated as possible. And yeah, in the end, you need someone to go over it. But
well,
in the future, that's going to be something that I'm going to be looking for.
The problem, I believe that you can automatically generate data flow diagrams. I do believe that you can do that in a lot of scenarios. You can write tooling that'll help you do that in a lot of scenarios. If you're in AWS, if you're in GCP, if you're in Azure, you can probably do it today. If you're using Terraform, software-defined networking of any kind, you can probably do it like within a couple of days. So a couple sitting, just parse your SDN files, make a graph. Cool, great, fine. That's not at all what I'm talking about. A threat model is the mapping the context of the real world to an idea of risk for your project or your company. And that can never be done by a robot because robots do not understand context. They can stab the fuck out of a watermelon, right? But they can't tell you why you wanted that.
An analogous comparison, the difference between a vulnerability assessment and a pen test. Most non-technical people or even non-security people who are generally technical would say, well, those are the same thing. No, they're not, because they're designed to achieve different goals. A vulnerability assessment is designed to tell you which vulns you have and how bad they affect you. A pen test is designed to give you the scope of an attacker. Very different things.
Yeah, so one other thing I want to add about trust boundaries that I find fascinating in a lot of environments is that usually, like, I consider trust boundaries to be a sacred cow. So in a lot of environments, there's this motivation. We all have that motivation. I think there's some element of imposter syndrome to this, but in the interest of making a threat model complete, you'll often see trust boundaries get drawn instead of outlining, incompleteness or unknowns. And I think that that's really dangerous, right? Because it prevents any consumer of that threat model in the future from being able to consider any additional threats or unknowns that may exist between components within a given diagram. Again, we talk a lot about how diagram-based threat modeling isn't necessarily beneficial, but that visualization and having just kind of this perceived boundary between component A and B can be incredibly reductive at the amount of threats that are in there. So, I tend to trust threat models that have I don't know or question marks a lot more than trusting diagrams that claim to be a complete representation of the potential threats that are represented in a system, especially for diagrams.
That's actually a really, really good point. I hadn't actually considered that before, but if you have a diagram and you just draw one line on it, that's a trust boundary. You've divided the space in half, and you might say, well, this is like the more secure side, this is the less secure side, but really that's probably not how it actually is, right? You don't necessarily know that your perimeter is to the internet is impermeable, for example, right?
Exactly.
And drawing that line means you're answering a question and you're creating a false impression in the person looking at the diagram that this is the secure side and this is the insecure side, when really it's the job of the threat model to say one of the risks that we need to be worried about is that our perimeter to the internet might be more permeable than we think. And that's maybe something we need to check out periodically in case there's like a misconfiguration somewhere. Right. Absolutely. And that would be something that should be aligned in a threat model. Right. But yeah, just drawing a line and saying secure over there, not secure over there is not necessarily read as a statement of like intent. It's someone might read that and think it's a fact. That's a really good point.
A different angle of this too is that, like, let's say, like I talked about the bias towards, I alluded to some motivations that individual security practitioners may have in their usage of trust boundaries, right? Like the imposter syndrome element, where they're just like, I don't really know how to talk to the risks in a specific area, so I'm going to define a trust boundary based on guarantees that other teams have given me. That's one motivation to a party that might be participating in the threat modeling process. From the engineer's standpoint, right? If you have application owners, product owners, or engineers who are participating in the exercise, they are also motivated to create these types of trust boundaries by virtue of their bias in the perception of what they like, the scope of what they own or the scope of what they control, right? And anything that exists beyond that from their perception, that's the trust boundary. So while trust boundary I guess what I'm trying to riff on is that trust boundaries mean different things to different audiences in the act and the practice of creating threat models. And it's really hilarious to see in practice to see those biases play out, especially when you start questioning them and pulling at those threads. You'll start to unravel a lot of a lot of bad assumptions that were made in the creation of those threat models.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I use trust boundaries quite a bit, but it's more like when you're thinking about sort of different segments of a network, what the rules are supposed to be. It's not necessarily like a statement, this is definitely how the implementation is 100% of the time. It's like data classification, right? It's like if you have some production, you have a production network and a dev network, and you've got a bunch of customer data, you want the customer data accessible from production, but not from the dev network, right? Now, you may often find customer data in your dev network, but that's a problem that needs to be addressed. Right. But if you say, if you think this never happens, then maybe you don't go looking for it. So I guess the big takeaway from this is your threat model should probably be able to express unknowns. You should be able to, the things you don't know could be a risk. And if you literally don't know what they are and you need to invest some in investigation or something, you could record that in the threat model. As a risk that needs more investment, but there's really no way of doing that in a data flow diagram. And in fact, the data flow diagram is going to take you in the other direction of trying to convince people of something that may or may not be true. And the people pressured to make the diagram are in turn, pressured to put something down. They have to put a line somewhere.
That's a good point that you call out, where like trust boundaries can be used effectively, but when they're used, it's to represent the expectation of, say, a policy or other types of some overarching governing expectation, right? That can be represented as that. But even in those scenarios, right, you still want to be able to say, this is our expectation, probably fallible, right? Like there's still a whole bunch of ways in which this expectation is undermined. And for the practitioners who are incredibly experienced in their environments, you can start listing off the top of your head all of the exceptions that undermine that expectation pretty much from the outset when you're creating the threat model, right? Because you already know all the ways in which that policy is being violated due to business need or what have you.
Yeah, and that kind of comes back to whether or not you can have a non-technical program manager do these. And I think the problem you run into is you kind of need somebody with, they used to call it the evil bit set. It's like the marketing product people, they're trying to find the silver lining to everything. They're trying to make everything okay, so that the customer will buy stuff or whatever. But that's and a lot of program managers and even a lot of engineers are kind of that, in that positive, constructive mindset. And I think you do need someone overseeing this who is like, anytime you draw a line on a piece of paper, they're like, is that a real line or is that like an aspirational line that we need to double check, right?
Yeah.
And it's not just the imposter syndrome too. I think it's there's a certain amount of like peer pressure to think that things are fine, that all of us mutants are mostly immune to, which is probably how we've ended up in this line of work. But
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good call out, and something that we touch on several places is that um, it's entirely okay to identify a problem and not do anything about it, right? Having the problem identified, explicitly documented, and then making a rational decision around it, whether or not it's actionable, whether or not you can afford to action it, right? Like, to your point, right? We go through prioritization in this exercise. There's a high watermark, and there's going to be a number of items that will not be addressed due to cost, due to a number of other reasons, right? But it is a bigger risk to have it not documented and unknown than it is to have it documented and referenceable, right?
yes,
Because then you get to decide at some point in the future whether or not that is a worthwhile investment due to changes that you consciously make to your product in the interest of servicing your customers, right? And that speaks to the comment you made earlier, where these are living documents, right? Like at no point are these supposed to be tabula rasa or something, right? Like this commandment that needs to be upheld at in perpetuity in relation to the product. That threat models are constantly changing as your infrastructure changes, as product features are introduced, etc.
and that's actually this is also related to the reason that I say, this is a brainstorming exercise and there are no wrong answers.
Yeah.
It's like it's also because you're making a list of all of the most shameful details of your project, right? And it's going to be a little bit uncomfortable, for everybody on some level. Even if it's not like your problem to fix it, you have to like get someone else to talk about it, and then it's just a little bit awkward of a thing. So it's really important that nobody gets into any fight. So it's like I stress it's all about brainstorming up front. We're going to talk about some bad stuff. We don't want to hear any silver linings. We don't want to make it okay. We're not here to solve the problem today. We're just here to make a list of all of the potential problems, including things that we are worried about, but we might not fully understand right now. And it's okay right now to admit that we don't understand it, because this is the context of like, we're making a list of things that we might need to invest more in the future, which means we need to know what we didn't do, what we don't have now, and it's very backwards from the way that most engineers view their day normally.
Yeah.
It's normally like, I am here, I'm building to get to there, and I want to get to, this point by the end of the week, and, I want to get to this point by the end of the sprint or whatever. And they're usually thinking, I always say the forward engineering is about thinking about how your system, is supposed to behave under the expected inputs.
Yeah.
And this is sort of like a reverse engineering kind of thing where you're thinking about the negative space. So you really need to be able to switch gears to like, what if, here's a Dataflow diagram like with our networks in it, but like, what if all of this is wrong? Like, what if these boundaries aren't quite as solid as we think? Or, what if people have like stood up proxies for some reason all over the place?
Exactly.
All right. So Justin, who has his first threat model due sometime next week, or whatever that is. Do you feel like you got what you needed to out of this discussion of threat modeling, or did we manage to confuse you with our big tangent about credit cards and was I talking about aliens at some point? Man, this went off the rails. But do you feel like you have enough to work with?
So I heard some new ideas that I'm definitely interested in, but like the main point that I got is that I'm already doing the thing that I should be doing, which is using an awesome Excel workbook that was made by someone else.
Yes, actually, that's a good takeaway. Yeah, I agree with that.
And I heard everybody mention some cool things that I'm going to look up, but no, the whole Dataflow diagram, like trying to create that without knowing what the resources were, without knowing anything about the code without knowing even the API calls or the infrastructure or anything. You can, and not being able to get in touch with the devs. You can imagine how frustrating that was.
Another big. Sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to add, like, if we're listing tools that would help someone perform such a task, Cartographer is a cool one to look at.
Yeah, that got mentioned earlier.
Also,
Yeah, I got that one.
Scout Suite is one we used to use.
Yeah, we got
Scout.
that one.
Yep, we mentioned that too.
To do M&A a lot. There's also one called C Suite or CSEC, which is pretty tiny, but that one's a really good, like, it's kind of like TechCrunch for threat modeling. Like, you type in the company stuff, and it's like a combination Nessus, Nmap, like Shodan, and then like with business risky stuff, like all as one big report. That one's kind of cool.
Those are really more like vulnerability analysis tools, but or like scanners. And a threat model is more kind of like abstract. Usually, it's like things you're worried about, even if you have no information about it yet, right? So you could add something to the threat model like, I'm worried about SQL injection, even though you have no idea if that matters at all, right? But it's like you can write total unknowns down if you're worried about it. And the reason you want to capture everything and give it a low score is because it prevents an argument the next time somebody has the same thought. The next time somebody thinks, even if it's a stupid idea, that it will never happen. The next time somebody thinks that, if they look at the threat model and it's already there and it's got a low score, they can stop thinking about it because it's written down. If it's written down, it's out of your head. That's a 43 folders thing. It was from anyone remember like Getting Things Done movement from like 15 years ago? Anyway, I still have a stack of Moleskine notebooks right here. Anyway, whatever. Anyway, so like, the other big selling point about using Excel instead of a more complicated tool is that these things often have to be updated. It has to be a living document, And the fact that everyone can use a spreadsheet without training or with minimal training, most people got trained on this in like middle school at this point.
Lotus 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, Lotus 1, 2, 3. But the fact that people can contribute to this without like spending 3 days in training that they're going to forget is actually hugely valuable just for the day-to-day practice of letting everyone feel like they can update it. Like you really need to crowdsource it for any sufficiently complicated project. For a small company that's got no budget, got no security team, let's be honest, they don't do threat modeling because their whole like startups. The whole purpose of a startup is to get someone to buy you in 3 years or less, right? You don't care about security at all until their M&A team shows up, right? And then all of a sudden you're like, bury the bodies, hide the skeletons, just keep smiling. Or I don't know. Like,
I have lived this life. He speaks the truth.
So I mean, like threat modeling for small companies is like, let's be real, no one's going to do it. But to the extent that it happens, your developers are doing it internally in their head, right? And hopefully they have some awareness of security bugs that they should be mitigating. But like the startup CEO is probably just a straight up sales guy who's just trying to sell the company the whole time, and just create the right atmosphere for the company to sell, Like the
majority of the let's be honest, for small businesses, the majority of the engineers are going to be like, just fresh 4-year college grads, or
they're going to be cheap. They're going to be inexpensive for some reason.
Their second computer science, their second developer job, and the second you start asking them these questions, they're just going to have this like non-flashback blank face moment where they're like, oh god, he's going to realize that everything I wrote was garbage. Like, someone's checking the backlog. Crap.
Yeah, but I mean it's not like I was the one developer at a startup one time and I feel like I did a good job, but it's like I tried really hard. There were some skeletons in those closets, but I don't know, it was a good time. Like it definitely isn't true of every single developer project. However, I also then later spent 10 years working as a security consultant, and So on the one hand, I feel like I did okay. I've definitely seen like hundreds of
Yeah.
small companies that had no threat model, no risk assessment, no awareness of security issues at all, because they were just focused on getting things to the point they could sell. And I also spent a good deal of time in the video game industry, and they don't like their whole. You could say they have a threat model, but their one critical thing on the threat model is performance.
Yeah.
Oh, if the performance isn't good, then no one will play the game. And it's like, cool, but I'm like God in your world. I can like make arbitrary objects appear anywhere and kill anything I want by looking at it, and nothing can kill me. So I don't imagine this is fun for everyone else, but okay.
Now that expanded a little bit in terms of risk model, only because the gaming has changed, but like you are like 80% not wrong, and also an identical industry to the same problems is the fucking film industry.
I have no idea what their threat model is. Like, honestly, I'd be really interested in hearing about that. All I know about it is like the screeners, right? They try and watermark the screeners, or they like who got it, and then but they always leak anyway. I don't know.
So here's the thing about piracy: most like the production studios and up, mostly don't give a shit about piracy past a certain date, and that's because of the way contracts get signed. So this is kind of interesting, right? So most movie houses are franchises, right? Which basically makes them mom and pop shops. They used to actually be mom and pop shops, but now it's all like AMC and whatever, right? But they're all franchises. So those studios usually spend 90% of their budget on one, maybe two films a year. And those are your Avengers or whatever the like summer blockbusters are going to be, right? Because the licensing fees for broadcast are incredibly expensive, and their point is that, well, what, like, 5 to 35-year-old this year isn't going to go see like Endgame, right? So that's the one they spend all their money on, and they know when it's going to come out early and whatever, and that's their KTLO. That's how they keep the lights on, right? The whole rest of the year is them trying to figure out what cult classics, what indie flicks, what anime, what weird niche shit that they're going to decide to play that their local community really wants to see. And that's where they make their profit, right? Here's the thing. That contract for Endgame or whatever, they got to sign that shit like a year in advance, right? They also got to pay usually at least 3 months out. It's usually like 6 months out, right? So they're leveraged until they make that money back. So from a studio's perspective, when shit hits the torrent sites, if it's not 6 months or newer, like between when it gets released, they don't give a fuck. Now that mom and pop shop where everybody was going to go see it, but they pirated it instead, they're out of business now. Right? And there's tons of documented evidence where this has actually happened. Like when Expendables 3 got leaked, like exactly 3 months early from its original release date, like there were whole chunks of theaters. There were like clusters of franchises in like middle America that like went out of business overnight. It was like a big thing. The other
does the same thing apply to television and television shows, or is it completely different?
No, television shows are completely different because as soon as the thing airs, they're done with it. They got their money from the ads.
Also, yeah, I was going to say, like, television's different because A, you have ads, and B, now it's even more different because, like, the streaming environment is very different than traditional television.
Well, I'm just wondering about the threat model.
Netflix gets paid monthly, no matter what, basically.
Yeah, I'm wondering about the threat model for the backstage tapes of The Apprentice.
I've worked numerous at this point, like IR gigs and a couple of pens that turned into IR gigs where it was like, well, the footage got leaked. How'd the footage get leaked? Oh no. Well, when your dailies get shot, how do your dailies get back to your editing room? Oh, we hire a bike contractor. We give him the compact flash drives and he runs it down. Well, where do you hire the bike contractors? Like, what? I don't know. It's just some service we found on Craigslist. Like, this is not a rarity. This is normal, right? Because from their perspective, like, unless it's the finished movie, we don't care.
And this is actually that's another vertical industry, another threat model, a different context, a totally different environment, totally different set of risks. But if you were making like a table of what your risks were, you can also in format, this is a living document, you can update it with root cause analysis, right? So when you have an incident, like the bike courier makes a copy or whatever, you go back to your threat model and you add that as we know this is a threat because this happened, right? And you just add that right on there from the root cause analysis. And then you go and you say, well, what are the mitigations going to be? Right. And then you've captured this in an actual document that everyone can understand. Okay, now we are going to vet our freaking couriers and maybe encrypt what goes on the drive or whatever. I don't know.
Accurately, we're going to judge the appropriate cost it would cost to vet our couriers, and we're going to see how much money we lost from the incident. Yeah. If it was less than that amount, then we're still going to mark this on the threat model, and the threat model is going to tell us that we should just accept this as the cost of doing business and never spend money on trying to secure it.
We did not talk about accepting risk yet. Actually, we've made it like 2.5 hours into a conversation about threat modeling without talking about
risk acceptance. Doesn't happen to any of our listeners. Don't just ignore that part. Let the business.
That's true. The reason we haven't mentioned that is because
shatter dreams now.
Yeah, none of us are personally willing to accept any risks at all. And we have a hard time when other people are like, we'll just accept it, and it's like, okay, but like, really, we need to talk about how much money is involved in this decision, just for a minute. Right?
ASPE people and not being able to.
Yeah. ASPE people, like not liking when people don't understand our narrow abstract area of focus.
This is the point in the episode where we all go very quiet and we hug all our listeners very tightly.
I'm stimming right now. I'm stimming. Oh, I gotta go to my happy place. Okay. All right. Oh boy. Yes. So
yeah.
Well, although, like, if people don't know, if they're just learning about threat modeling now, maybe we should mention it. So there is a thing where you put a threat on the threat model and you literally just decide you're not going to do anything about it, and they call that accepting a risk, right? And sometimes there is most companies. There are two schools of thought on this. Some companies will accept risks and just say, that's fine, whatever, I'll sign off on it, we don't care. And some companies, due to compliance reasons or regulatory reasons, or if they hit some of these red line things, like if their product is involved in safety, like control systems, they literally cannot accept risks. They can have temporary exceptions, right? Which is a different philosophy, which says that we will accept this for a period of time, but only under the condition that we come up with a remediation plan, right? And that's kind of that's the more kind of responsible or more security forward approach, but it's not always necessary or financially a good idea. It depends on the context.
There's actually a third model. There's the kick the can model. So for businesses that actually don't have a security context, right? You can have the deferment model, but the rationalization behind the deferment model, there's two outcomes from that deferment. Either a remediation plan can be introduced as a result of this risk, in fact, being reinforced or still applying to the product, right? And now you have some like real dollar amounts that you can assign to it because you have actual user data. You have there's additional context that you can apply to the risk after the initial annual deferment, like annual period of deferment. Or they can say, hey, look, our product changed direction, so this risk is now no longer an issue. And then it's not even risk acceptance, it's annulled, right? Because the product ended up agile, yay, it changed tack.
Oh, well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, if the thing's invalid, it's invalid.
Yeah,
absolutely. Like, yeah. So what you're saying is that people basically ask for risk exceptions out until their product goes away entirely, and then it becomes a moot point.
Yeah.
Kick the can. I like that. Yeah.
It's yeah. So there's the two models, and then there's the third one, kick the can, where you don't have any safety or regulatory enforcement, but you still want to do. You want something a little bit more. I actually view the kick the can model as being more mature than the first scenario you outlined. in which you have risk acceptance, but it's persistent or permanent in some way. That's usually
I do too. I think
too much.
The kick the can model would give you a way of transitioning into a more formal, strict model, right? Because at least you're making people periodically view the exceptions, right? You're making people periodically think about all of the horrible holes they've left everywhere. Right?
Yeah, no, that was really fun because you might have like leadership changeovers and things.
Yeah.
So it's like, then it's like, okay, time to go over the debt ledger, and you just like hit them with a big ass binder. Where it's like, here's all the threats we've been tracking for you. Which one do you want to check off today?
Just make sure you have a camera ready for the Reddit channel or the subreddit. Watch people die inside, because that is totally fodder for that. Awesome.
Totally.
Thank you everyone for joining us. This has been a really excellent conversation. I think we're gonna wrap it up because we're coming up on the time. And I'm gonna go to Justin one last time. All right. Does anyone have any final questions or comments? Actually, let's go around once. If there's one thing you would like people to take away from this discussion on threat modeling, what would it be? For me, I wanted people to understand that it is not hard, it is not complicated, it is fancy words around something that everybody does every day. And that all it is you're making a list of all the things you're worried about, and then you're trying to assign some numbers to them about how much you're worried about them. And this is just to do long-term planning, resource allocation, ask your boss for more money with a reason, right? And it's just, I think that the Shostack book, I think it just scares people into thinking that things are way more complicated than they are, and that somehow they have to do a data flow diagram because of security, when really they should be doing data flow diagrams because of design. But tangent. So that's basically my big takeaway. Justin?
I was happy to get reinforcement about the Excel workbooks, because it makes me feel like I'm on the right track with that, and also my frustrations with the data flow diagram. Hearing
you are not alone, man. That's a super common problem.
Hearing that the data flow diagram is, it is not a threat model, although it can be extremely valuable and important.
Yes,
the two should be separated. And that's it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Final, Daniel, any takeaways?
I would hope that the biggest thing that I would want readers to walk away with is that there are two things. One, all business practices have optimizations that can be found through automation, and this practice in particular, threat modeling, is no different. And two, the second thing that I wanted to make sure that all listeners walked away with is that there are a lot of really interesting tangible benefits that can be applied to your internal systems, toolings, and processes when you start thinking about things in that actuary mindset, right? That actuary model can be applied in a lot of interesting ways, especially when you start getting into the nitty gritties of CI/CD and Agile, and all the tooling involved. Actuary models get really, really interesting when you start thinking about things like probability of error is equivalent to or related to probability of human action, right? Turns out if you can measure how many things your people are doing, you can start getting really into some really interesting space in measuring what type of risk is present across your entire, again, more automation, better inventory management systems, more data for you to perform to have actuary models applied against. And there's some really interesting space there to explore.
Holy smokes. That was a really good point. So actually that's a thought I never had before. I'd like to just put a flag on that, because what you're saying is basically, if you want to know what you should be worried about, focus on what your people do rather than what was already automated, right?
Yes.
So I get it, right? So you automate things so that you don't need to worry about them anymore, because a program that just runs in a loop, or like a cron job, will fail way.
Finite.
It
Non-determinism, non-finite.
Yeah, exactly. It will fail way less often than a human. Which I mean, how many times have I fucked up a Linux command line today? You know, like I fat finger things like one out of three.
On a bash shell script like 3 hours last night. I'm so angry at myself.
Yeah, I mean, people barely do anything right. Like, individually, like every other thing might be right, but that's only like 50%.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. That's an interesting way of looking at it.
I could talk about this stuff a lot. I really love this space, but I almost think it's like almost an entirely different episode about how we start getting into like how do you track and monitor developers, and how does that translate to risk scoring and threat detection.
So like process automation around security and
then where do you draw the line between context? What a computer can't do? Like, where's the line drawn? Yeah.
Well, typically computers never understand context because they don't understand.
Well, yeah,
it's a machine. It's a machine.
It's
a stupid machine. It's reading off an infinite tape, and it's I don't know, doing things.
Yeah, the human has to draw the line.
From an actuary modeling standpoint, you end up weighting and skewing towards greater risk being present in the human actions versus the automated ones, as a byproduct of the fact that the automated ones are directly measurable. Like, and if you have all of these, because Stride was around for so long and it finds its way in the collective psyche of engineering everywhere now, because thanks Microsoft. You often get into places where like so much of your CI/CD automation already has some answers to the questions around non-repudiation and other types of things. So like the data quality is pretty good. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. So yeah. Anyway, like my point is like whatever you can get a bot to already do for you, that's not usually the thing that's going to scare you the most. It's what the humans are doing outside of the bots. That's the part that's scary you the most.
That is, I wish you'd brought that up like in the beginning, because man, there's a lot to dig into there. But that is a really good point, and definitely something I'm going to think about. Now you just reminded me, we talked about Stride. We went through Dread. I don't even remember what those letters stand for, but it's like basically similar to Stride with different synonyms.
Dread stands for damage, reproducibility, exploitability, affected users, and discoverability. It's actually all of those letters directly correlate into two columns. Likelihood or impact.
Yeah,
it's just one scoring system. And that's why Dread is always my favorite. And then anytime somebody brings up Stride, I'm like, no, these are not the same. They don't belong in the same conversation.
This is the annoying thing, right? Like it's been likelihood and impact for hundreds of years, like till like the 17th century, at least, probably back before that, right? And I mean, it was called different things, but it's basic probability math. That's all it is. To think about risk. That's the whole point. So it's like, it really annoys me when somebody tries to take something that should be universal, simple human knowledge and make it all complicated and wrap a product around it, right? And I'm not blaming Shostack for writing the book at all. He was just trying to do an academic study of like how to manage risk at Microsoft, basically. But like now, like there's like threat modeler, Arius risk. Like people are doing trainings where they're saying, oh, you should do threat modeling. This is what a threat model looks like. Use the Microsoft threat modeling tool, because they're trainers. They don't do it themselves, right? They're just like repeating what they think is what people are doing, and it's just like this is all useless cruft on top of something that everyone should understand already if you just explain it right. Like you're just doing the thing that you do for yourself when you decide whether or not to pay a parking ticket, right? Like you just do that at the company level. And by the way, like my personal threat model for when like how I decide which parking tickets to pay is actually really interesting, but that's another conversation. But that reminded me, I worked for a company that was super lazy, and they wanted their own kind of threat modeling scheme. And they looked at Stride, but they were like, nobody could figure out what repudiation meant. So they were like, we're going to make a new one, and we're going to call it Tides.
Oh, God.
It's all the same letters, but with no R. And I was like, yeah, that's awesome. Why don't you just call it E? or like just call it ED. It's either escalation or denial of service, which is every escalation is a denial of service, but not every denial of service is an escalation, right? So that's it. You have ED. You can get Bob Dole to be your spokesman.
ED better than VD.
How does
Also-
but how does escalation?
And can you non-repudiate that?
Virus. Any closing thoughts?
This is about how many fights you win. Threat modeling is about deciding how you survive to the next fight because you're going to lose this one.
I mean, it really comes down to it's like, what's the saying? It's like you don't have to outrun the tiger, you just have to outrun the next guy.
Yeah.
You don't have to outrun the
That's
bear.
threat,
You just
that's
gotta
threat
outrun the guy
modeling
next to
to a
you.
T.
Yeah.
Don't outrun the bear.
Yeah. I don't know what's up with my audio, man. I gotta.
Yeah, we gotta. We gotta
all right.
Do our exit.
All right. The sound of our blood sugar dropping means it's time to
Yes.
draw this out. This means it's time to draw this episode to a close. So thank you for everybody. Thank you to everybody for joining the call. It's really, really good to talk to you guys. This has been an excellent discussion. If someone could remind me how we end these episodes.
Oh yeah.
Oh, hey. Now more than ever, remember, now more than ever, hacking is not just a crime. It's a survival,
It's a survival trade. There it is.
Man. I gotta write that down.